My name is Kale, rank F Hunter. The kind nobody remembers after the dungeon raid is over and the loot gets divided. The system handed me a skill on my 18th birthday. Everyone in the world gets exactly one. Mine was called Possession. Sounded incredible, right? Dark magic, assassin energy, slipping into enemies and tearing them apart from the inside. That kind of thing. The full tooltip read, temporarily inhabit the body or vessel of a target. Duration 10 minutes, cooldown 24 hours. 10 minutes per day. System rating. F tier. The literal basement of the skill ladder. Below skills that let you grow slightly better fingernails. I showed it to the clerk at the Hunter registration office. He looked at me like I'd sneezed on something he owned. He stamped my card without saying much. F rank. Handed it back. Pointed at the door with his chin. The whole process took about 15 seconds. That was 3 years ago. Those 3 years did something to me. Not broke me exactly. More like ground me down to a different shape. I ran the dungeon jobs nobody else would take. D-rank kobold caves. E-rank rat warrens with ceilings too low to stand upright. The kind of places that smelled like old fear and monster bile and where 4 hours of work bought you a meal. Maybe 2 if you skipped the drink. But here's the thing about having a skill the system considers worthless. You spend a lot of time alone thinking about it. I mean serious time. Lying on my rented mattress at 2 a.m. running every word of the tooltip through my head. Inhabit, body, or vessel. Target. Around month 14, I was hiding behind a boulder in a D-rank dungeon watching the other hunters take down a stone golem. I thought, what if the rules don't actually specify living targets? What if a golem counts? Stone and magic jammed into a shape. That is technically a vessel. I reached out with the skill and pointed it at the golem the way you point at something you're not fully sure will work. Held my breath. For 10 minutes, I was made of stone. I felt the dungeon floor through feet that weighed 400 kilos. I felt the rock of the walls as a kind of extension of my own body. I felt the hum of the binding spell in my chest like a second heartbeat. When the timer snapped me back, I was shaking so hard I had to sit down, not from fear, from the understanding that hit me all at once. The skill had no limits on what counted as a vessel. Everything is a vessel for something. By month 18, I had possessed a river in flood season, the idea of fire inside a burning granary, and the shadow of a watchtower at noon. I also possessed the memory of a dead man, the one his widow kept so carefully that it had density to it, presence, a shape the skill could hold. 10 minutes being a dead man's echo. 10 minutes knowing what it felt like to be loved that completely by one specific person. Then the timer ended. I was back on my rented mattress with a cracked window and a skill the system considered barely worth logging. The contrast was not subtle, but here's what I understood after all of it. Belief makes vessels. Not divine power, not ancient magic, just belief. The more people believe in something, the denser it becomes. The denser it becomes, the more there is for me to step into and operate from. A man believes in his sword hard enough, the sword becomes a vessel. A city believes in its walls for centuries, the walls become a vessel. And if 40 million people believe in a god for 300 years straight, that god becomes the largest vessel on the continent, whether anyone is home or not. It started with a sword because everything in this world starts with a sword. Some famous hunter named Grevin the Iron went into the sunken citadel, didn't come back. His weapon got recovered by the retrieval team. They go in for gear only, no fighting required. An S-rank blade, 40 years of accumulated killing compressed into metal. It showed up at auction. Bidding started at 50,000 gold. So far out of my range, it was almost funny. But the auction house let people touch it before bidding. The auctioneer called it feeling the history. He had the tone of someone who charged admission for the experience of almost owning something extraordinary. I went because I was curious, and also because the auction hall was heated and my room had a broken window. I will not pretend otherwise. When my turn came at the viewing table, I put my hand on the hilt. My possession skill activated on its own without me triggering it. Not for 10 minutes, for 3 hours. From outside, apparently, I just stood there. Blank face, still breathing. Staff got increasingly concerned. From inside, I was everything Grevon had ever believed about himself. His conviction that strength was obligation, not reward. His grief when his apprentice died. His stubbornness in returning to the sunken citadel year after year because he'd made a promise and the fact of death didn't feel like it dissolved a promise. And underneath all of it, the reason the sword had reached for me specifically. There was an unfinished shape inside it, something with no ending yet. Whatever I was, whatever the skill was, the sword recognized it as a thing that could hold that shape. Maybe even finish it eventually. It grabbed me before I could choose. I did not know what the task was. 3 hours was not enough to understand all of it. I came back to my body on the auction hall floor with blood on my upper lip. 3 worried staff members. 1 offered a healer. I declined. I sat up and looked at the golden sword on its velvet cushion for a moment. Then I stood up and walked out into the cold night. Did not look back at the sword. I had learned what I came to learn. The skill had no ceiling. Duration limits were not real limits. They were just where I had stopped before. The vessel determined how long I could stay. One man's lifetime of belief held me for 3 hours. A civilization's 3 centuries of faith would hold me for something I could not yet calculate. And nobody was inside it. The Empire of Selene covered the largest landmass of any human nation on the continent. 40 million people, 200,000 soldiers, 3 major cities. At the center of everything there was a religion, the Selene faith, monotheistic, meaning one God, and that God's name was Arath, God of light, judgment, and order. Every coin, every royal decree, every temple lintel in the empire carried Arath's name or seal. The church owned more land than any noble family. I grew up near the border, and I knew the faith from the missionaries. Very enthusiastic people, the kind that made you want to cross the street to avoid the pamphlets. None of those pamphlets mentioned the important part. Arath had not spoken to anyone in 300 years. Total silence, not a whisper. The priests explained this as a test of faith. The scholars called it divine withdrawal. The cynics said there was never a god at all, just a useful story dressed in ceremony. The cynics were nearly right. Something had occupied that vessel once. But whatever it was gone now. It had been gone for 3 centuries. The vessel itself remained. 40 million people still praying every day to a point in space that had nothing inside it. 3 centuries of faith with no one home. Until now. That was about to change, and the change would require 2 months of walking through cold weather to reach the place where I could begin it. Getting to Selene City took 2 months on foot. I sold my dungeon gear for travel money and spent the last of it on boots, because blisters at mile 40 teach you things. The Grand Temple of Arath was everything you expected, and then more of it. White marble that hurt your eyes, columns so tall that birds nested at the tops, gold leaf on every surface that could hold it, and several that could not. Priests in white gliding on polished stone with the grace of people who considered dignified movement a form of worship. I went in as a pilgrim with a borrowed token from a man on the road who had lost his nerve at the gate and couldn't make himself enter. Very useful borrowing. I knelt at the main altar with 50 other pilgrims. And very quietly, feeling genuinely uncertain about whether this would work or simply end me, I reached out toward the vessel. Finding it was not difficult. You do not search for a city when you are standing inside it. The faith was in the walls, in the light through the glass, in the very air. But reaching in was something else entirely. The moment I touched the edge of it, I understood the difference between the sword and this. The sword had been one man's belief. Dense, personal, specific, shaped by 40 years of choices. This was 40 million people across 300 years. It had no edges. The weight of it pressed against my mind like trying to hold up an ocean with both hands. I genuinely thought for a moment that I had made a fatal miscalculation. Then I thought, the system has been wrong about me for 3 years. I'm not stopping here. I held on, pulled myself in, and then I was everywhere at once. Every temple on the continent simultaneously, not as a visitor, as the space they existed inside, as what every upturned face was looking toward. Prayers arrived like weather. Not individual sounds, but a mass of them, the way a city sounds from a rooftop. Millions of voices impossible to separate, but unmistakable as a whole. The word I would use is weight, the accumulated hope and fear and grief and bargaining of 40 million people pressing inward from all directions at once. I nearly panicked. I was 21 years old. I had mopped dungeon blood off my boots 3 times a week for 3 years. I had not prepared for the scale of this expectation. And then, inside all that mass of sound and weight, I heard a single voice. A specific prayer, clear and separate like a candle in a lit room. A woman's voice, exhausted, a border town, eastern province, small chapel with 12 regular worshippers, 20 years of ministry to a god who had never once replied. She said, Arath, my lord. The governor demands half our grain reserves for the eastern campaign. Half. These families will not survive winter without it. She had filed petitions. She had made appeals. Nobody listened to a border priest with 12 attendants. She was out of options that made sense. She was trying the option that probably didn't. I want to tell you, I answered because it was right. It was. But the honest thought was, I know this shape. Dungeon maps in bad light, trapped situation with a hidden exit. I know how this works. The governor had power. She had moral authority and nothing else. That was not as asymmetric as it appeared. She just could not see what she had to use. I sent her something. Not words, not thunder. The specific feeling that arrives in your chest when you have been scared, and then you understand the answer. The specific feeling that says you have more leverage than you are currently seeing. You know which lever to pull. Stop hesitating and use it. She gasped in her empty chapel, stood up from her knees. Her eyes were wet. 300 years of silence from a god, and then suddenly something arrived. She whispered to the empty room that he had answered. After all this time. She sounded less like someone receiving a miracle and more like someone whose work had finally been acknowledged. She walked out of that chapel with her back straight. I lost track of her shortly after, as the strain of holding something that size pulled me back out. 6 hours inside the vessel, 6 times the sword. I came back to my body lying on the marble floor of the Grand Temple. A young priest was crouching over me. His name was Brother Aldrich, 23 years old, the face of someone who had been trained to handle unconscious pilgrims and was doing his absolute best. He said I'd been glowing faintly for approximately 6 hours and that they had almost called a healer, but my breathing seemed normal, so they waited. I sat up, looked at the great golden statue of Orath at the altar. Excellent craftsmanship. Someone had understood what people needed to see when they looked at a god. I told him I needed to join the priesthood. He explains the entry process. I told him to sign me up. He filed my paperwork that same evening and personally vouched for my application. Later, I thought about why he did that. A stranger glows for 6 hours on the temple floor, and a young priest decides to help them. Some people are built like that. The trials took 8 months. I've never worked harder at anything in my life. The Canticles of Orath alone were 600 verses with associated ritual timing. The calendar of the faith covered every day of the year with specific requirements. Holy days, fasting periods, feast days, days of judgment. Liturgical precision was not optional. The church hierarchy was its own puzzle. Bishops above temple wardens, archbishops above bishops, the high council above archbishops, the high priest above all of it. Inquisitors operating laterally across every level with authority to walk into any room and begin questioning anyone. The kind of structure that works because everyone agrees to pretend it makes sense. The theology itself was interesting once I got past the ceremony. Orath was light and judgment and order, not warmth and mercy and peace. The distinction mattered. This was not a comforting faith. It was a demanding one. Detailed opinions about grain storage and dispute resolution and the responsibilities of landowners. Practical in a way that surprised me. Written by someone who understood how to run a civilization and knew that most people would follow rules better if the rules came from something larger than another person. Good engineering. I spent 8 months studying it and came out genuinely respecting the original design, whatever happened to the thing that was supposed to occupy it. I passed everything. Became Brother Kale, junior initiate of the Third Temple, assigned to general duties. My specific assignment was the East Corridor, weekly mopping. Nobody noticed me. Junior initiates in large institutions are as close to invisible as a person can get while still technically being present. Useful situation. Every night after the evening prayers, after the senior clergy retired and the temple went quiet, I went to my cell and reached back into the vessel. The first attempts after the initial plunge were still overwhelming, too much at once. I came back from early sessions with headaches that lasted 2 days and nosebleeds that stained my pillow. But skill grew with practice, or more accurately, I grew into it the way you grow into a coat that was too large when you first tried it on. By month 3, I could hold the connection for 4 hours and return without physical damage. By month 5, I could focus on specific regions of the Empire. By month 7, I could filter by type, decision-related prayers only, or prayers mentioning names I had encountered before, the information architecture of an empire's faith, learned one night at a time. The range of what people prayed for was not what I expected. I had imagined petitions for healing and weather and crops, and there was that, genuinely. Farmers worried about frost, mothers at children's bedsides, soldiers writing prayers before engagements they were not sure they would survive. All of it real and heavy. Those were the hardest to receive. Because I was not actually omnipotent. I could push certain decisions in certain directions. I could not make rain fall or heal what was sick. When a child prayed for a father to come home from the war, I had nothing to give that child. All I could do was work on ending the war faster from a different angle. Cold math. But it was all I had. Then there were the other kind of prayers. The ones from people whose decisions actually moved things in the world when they made them. A bishop asked whether a trade agreement violated doctrine. I sent the sense that the main terms were sound, but one clause on dye tariffs needed another look before he signed anything. He stayed up until 3 a.m. redrafting that clause. 3 years later, it prevented a trade dispute that would have destabilized 2 provinces. A northern campaign general praying for a sign before an offensive. I sent him stillness, the specific feeling of a situation that is not ready to move yet. He waited. The enemies had set an ambush that morning and given up and relocated by afternoon. He led his troops through clean. His soldiers came home. The High Inquisitor, a man named Torvin, known for being both brilliant and pitiless, asked whether the woman in his dungeon was a genuine heretic or simply unlucky enough to be accused by someone with a grudge. I sent him a direction, not words. A tilt of attention toward the accuser's recent property acquisitions and the timeline of when those acquisitions were made. Torvin looked. The accuser had acquired the accused woman's farmland 2 weeks after filing the accusation. It was his 3rd time using this method. The Inquisitor was not pleased. He executed the accuser and released the woman. She walked out into daylight with 11 months of false imprisonment behind her and a formal written apology in her hand. She did not pray again for 3 years. When she finally did, it was a single sentence. Thank you, that was all. That one I will not pretend did not matter to me. It did. Working at the scale of an empire, that single outcome still does. By the end of my first year, from the East Corridor with a mop, 2 military campaigns redirected from disaster, 7 executions stopped, 1 province-wide starvation event prevented before it started. None of it was dramatic, no thunderbolts, no divine appearances, just the right feeling arriving at the right moment in the minds of people who were already capable of doing the right thing. I also started a rumor, very carefully and with no fingerprints on it whatsoever, that Arath had begun speaking to people again after 3 centuries of silence. I did not start it directly. Sarah of the Eastern Reach had already started it herself when she walked out of her chapel and protected her town's grain. She told people. Those people told others. By month 12, the story reached the capital. Pilgrims with unusual prayer impressions. A northern priest who had nearly made a catastrophic error and had somehow understood it was wrong just in time. The high priest Vorden heard the reports. He was fat and shrewd, and had managed the church's period of divine silence for 22 years with considerable skill. He had been framing the silence as mystery, the absence as depth, the lack of communication as a test the faithful were honor-bound to pass. He was good at it. And now something was disrupting that very well-managed narrative. He called a meeting of the senior clergy. I was not invited. Junior quarter moppers do not attend senior clergy meetings. But temple walls carry sound, and I had the vessel as a backup, and I learned everything I needed to learn about Vorden's response before he finished deciding on it. His stated position, careful theological assessment required before any public claims. His actual position, this disrupts the institution's power balance, and I need to get ahead of it. Intelligent. The response of someone who understood that power and narrative were the same thing, and that whoever controlled the story of the god's return would control everything downstream. He was 22 years too late to get ahead of what was already happening, and I had absolutely no intention of slowing down to let him catch up. The prayer that changed the shape of everything came in the 2nd month of my 2nd year inside the priesthood. I'd been hearing it for weeks before I understood what it was. Same voice every night, same time, almost word for word identical. The voice of someone who chose language carefully. It said, Arath, I don't know if you're real. I think the probability is very low, but I've exhausted every option I actually believe in, so I'm trying one I don't. Then it would lay out a situation, not like a prayer, like a briefing document, context, history, identified problems, stated request. The most analytical prayer I had ever received. The situation, the Empire was preparing a war, Eastern Border Campaign. Official justification was a 50-year territorial dispute that had never quite resolved. Real justification. 3 members of the Emperor's inner council had made financial investments in military supply contracts and needed a war for those investments to pay off. 100,000 soldiers to be deployed. Conservative casualty estimates, 30,000. Duration, 3 to 5 years. Treasury cost outlined with associated economic ripple effects. She had filed 7 petitions, requested audiences, sent documented letters about the doctrinal implications of a war driven by private financial benefit to every oversight body she could reach. Nothing moved, because everyone with institutional power either benefited from the campaign or feared the people who benefited. She had run out of things that made sense. 31 nights of this prayer, same words, same structure, slightly more exhausted in tone each time. On the 32nd night I answered. Her name was Mira Len, court scholar, 28 years old. No family name, which in Solene meant no inherited social footing, which meant everything she had built herself. She had gotten to her position by being more thorough and more accurate than everyone around her, which also meant she had no political protection whatsoever. Anyone with institutional power could ignore her indefinitely with no consequence, which they had been doing for 7 documented attempts. What I sent her was specific, not the general sense of settled certainty I gave to most people, something more directed. An image from deep in the accumulated history of the vessel. A throne room. The imperial throne room specifically. The emperor's seat, empty. And in front of it, not a person. A set of documents with specific seals. That was all I sent her. No explanation attached, no interpretation offered. Just the image and the particular weight that made it feel important. She woke up at 3 a.m. with it burned behind her eyes. Spent 3 days going through every record she could access, looking for documents with those seals. She found them. Financial disclosure records that 3 council members were legally required to file, but had routed through a subsidiary body with reduced scrutiny requirements. She combined it all with her supply contract evidence and requested a formal audience with the High Priest's office citing urgent doctrinal concern. Vorden saw the angle and granted it. I was mopping the East Corridor when this meeting happened. very much not present in any official capacity. But I watched through the vessel. Vorden listened carefully, asked precise questions, and thanked her for bringing the matter to the church's attention. The response of a powerful man taking information without making commitments. Mira walked out of his office and stood in the courtyard in the afternoon light. I imagined the feeling of having done everything correctly and still not knowing if it will work. That night, her prayer was different. Not to Arath, just words to the air. She did not know what had happened, but she was going to try the thing she had seen and go find those papers. Good, I thought, from whatever distributed presence I occupied across 40 million people's accumulated hope. That is exactly right. Try the thing. The war was postponed 6 weeks after Miralyn walked out of the High Priest's office. The chain of events between those 2 points was long, and I will not map every link for you. The short version, Mira's evidence, combined with the church's quiet signal that doctrinal review of the campaign's justification was ongoing, made 2 of the 3 council members nervous. Isolated, the third made a financial decision that was technically legal, but looked terrible to the right observer. Someone found it, someone with enough standing to escalate. The Emperor's chief advisor resigned. The campaign's primary financial sponsors became unavailable for planning meetings. The military momentum stalled and did not recover that season. 30,000 soldiers who would have been deployed that spring were not deployed. 30,000 specific people who would have gone and some of whom would not have returned. Nothing exploded. No heroes faced each other across the battlefield. A scholar filed papers, a high priest felt political pressure, 3 wealthy men got nervous, and a campaign that would have killed people simply did not happen. This is the thing I was starting to understand about working at this scale. The dramatic version of power is standing in front of an army and making it stop. The real version is making sure the army never forms. Quieter, less satisfying in a certain way. The people who would have died that spring are alive. Some of them are farming, some are raising children, some are doing nothing remarkable at all. The math on that is not complicated. Month 20, month 21, I was promoted from junior initiate to second rank, which meant a slightly better cell and occasional access to non-confidential senior clergy discussions as a note-taker. Note-taker means corner of the room, pen in hand, invisible by institutional convention. This was the most strategically useful promotion I could possibly have received. I sat in those meetings and listened to senior clergy discuss the empire, the faith, and the growing reports of divine communication that kept arriving from across the provinces. Vorden was managing the narrative with genuine skill, controlling which reports got validated, which got questioned, framing the whole phenomenon as a renewal the church's leadership had created conditions for. He was not entirely wrong that the institution's stability had helped preserve the vessel. He was entirely wrong about being responsible for what was happening inside it. I sat in my corner taking notes and reacted to none of this in any visible way. Reacting visibly would have been unprofessional and also would have gotten me removed from the room. But I was watching Vorden carefully, because he was setting something up. I could feel it in the vessel through his prayers, and I could see it in the meeting notes I was transcribing. Vorden intended to insert the High Priest's office into the imperial succession question. The Emperor had no direct heir. 3 candidates existed, none of them compelling. Vorden planned to declare that Arath had indicated a preference. He had not consulted the god. He was constructing an endorsement for whichever candidate gave his office the most control afterward. I lay in my cell that night and thought about the irony of that. The High Priest of the faith that housed the vessel I lived in was planning to forge a divine message, while the actual occupant of the vessel was lying 300 meters away in the east wing thinking about whether there was enough time to stop it. It would have been funny if the stakes were not a generation of imperial policy and everyone who would live or die under whoever sat on that throne next. I had 3 weeks before the formal convocation announcement. 3 weeks is not a long time at this scale, but I had learned to work quickly and leave nothing visible behind. 3 succession candidates: Lord Aaron, the Emperor's nephew; Lady Dasha, the Emperor's second cousin governing the southern province; Commander Folt, a military hero with no blood claim. Vorden had already chosen Aaron. His calculation: Aaron was malleable, held no strong convictions, and had already signaled willingness to defer to the church on spiritual governance matters. In practice, this meant Aaron would let Vorden run things while wearing the crown. Vorden thought this was good for the faith. He was wrong about what the faith actually needed. I spent 3 nights inside Aaron's prayers. He wanted the throne for the status of it, not for what you could do from the position. That kind of person is fine in stable times. Stable times do not last. Dasha prayed differently. She prayed for competence, for the clarity to understand problems before attempting to solve them, for patience with complicated systems. Her prayers about the province contained actual names, specific district administrators, particular grain yield patterns by region, named disputes between fishing guilds along the southern coast. She prayed about those things because she was thinking about them. She was doing the job she currently had, not the larger one she might get, the present work fully. On one occasion, she had prayed about why Aurath allowed suffering, why a god of order permitted so much disorder. It was a genuine question asked without performance. I sent her the feeling that the question was more important than any available answer, that sitting with the discomfort of not knowing was itself a kind of preparation for something. She wrote it down in a journal afterward. I found out later. She wrote, "The question might be more important than the answer. Asking might be how we become people who can hold the answer eventually." That was Dasha. That was exactly the shape of her mind. And it was the shape the Empire was going to need in the decades ahead. I spent 3 weeks making real information visible to the right people. Aaron's business ties, their proximity to future conflicts. Dasha's flood response, genuinely successful, barely reported. I did not invent anything. I found things that were real, and made sure they were visible to the people who needed to see them. That is the entire method. And I answered Vorden's prayer. He had prayed privately for clarity on the succession. In a perfunctory way, the prayer of a man who has decided and wants confirmation. I did not confirm. I sent him something long and uncomfortable. The full weight of 300 years of accumulated trust pressing down on a single question. What happens to the people who believe in you when you lie to them on their behalf? What does trust actually cost the person receiving it? What does breaking it actually cost? Not as punishment, not as threat, just the actual feeling of what those words mean when they are taken seriously by someone who is supposed to be their guardian. Vorden spent 2 days in private prayer after receiving that. His assistants said he seemed unsettled. On the day of the formal announcement, he endorsed Dasha. I ate breakfast in the East Wing canteen and reacted to this information in no visible way whatsoever, but just another junior priest eating bread at a long table. Nothing to see. In month 22, something else happened that I should tell you about. Brother Aldrich found me in the East Corridor wearing the expression of someone who had been deciding whether to speak for several days. There had been observations, he said. Not accusations. He was careful. But some older brothers had noticed I seemed informed about distant events in ways that were difficult to explain. He said he had not reported these observations to anyone. He said he would not, unless whatever I was doing turned out to be harmful. He said this last part like he was apologizing for it. I understood what he was doing. He was a good person doing the thing good people do, warning you before the situation escalates, rather than simply allowing it to escalate. I thought about it for a moment. Then I told him the truth in the form I could offer. I was not Aurath. I was a 21-year-old former F-rank hunter from the border territories. Those were two very different things. But yes, I could hear the prayers. And I was trying to use that access to make things better rather than worse. He was quiet long enough that I thought I had made a mistake. Then he said, "Okay, just that. Okay." He picked up the other end of the mop bucket and helped me finish the corridor. We did not discuss it again for 4 months, but he started making sure I had access to reports and meeting notes that a junior initiate technically should not see. He decided to help without being asked again. I am still thinking about what that means, about the particular kind of trust that does not require a full explanation before it extends itself. Month 25 brought a problem with a name, General Cavan, 15 years of border warfare. He cared whether his soldiers came home, which made them fight harder, which meant he won. In those 15 years, he had developed a complete faith in Aurath, the kind soldiers sometimes arrive at after enough situations where you desperately need something larger than yourself. He prayed every night in his campaign tent, long and detailed. He took the faith more seriously than most of the actual clergy I now lived with daily. He had heard the reports of divine communication resuming. He had interpreted them in one specific direction, and that direction was toward a question he had been sitting on for months. His prayer was, "Aurath, the Empire is weak in its leadership. Not militarily, we can fight. Weak in who is making the decisions. The council is corrupt. I have documentation, I have had it for months." He continued, "I have not acted because soldiers do not do politics. But if you are speaking again, tell me, is this the moment to remove the weak leadership and build something worthy of the people beneath it?" He was not praying for permission to start a civil war. Not quite. He was asking whether the moment had arrived when the right thing and the politically possible thing finally coincided. A good man asking whether the good choice had become the available choice. That is a harder prayer to answer than most. I sat with it for 3 days. I thought through the shape of what a military coup led by a good general with real evidence and genuine grievances was likely to actually produce. Possible success, 30%. More likely outcome, civil war, 5 years minimum. The northeastern border gets exploited during the chaos. The empire contracts significantly. A decade later, you are in exactly the same situation, but with fewer people and more ruins. Kavan was the right person for the wrong plan at the wrong time. On the 4th night I answered him, not certainty, not a direction toward action, something more specific than either of those, a memory from deep in the vessel's accumulated history, a single candle in a very dark room, and pressed into it like a hand into clay. It is not time for fire. Be the light that helps others find the matches. Cavan lay still in his campaign tent for a long time after that. When he got up, he filed his corruption evidence anonymously through official channels where it would wait until someone had reason to look. Then he went back to the border wars, stayed in his role, kept winning the fights he was built to win, and left the political restructuring to the system he had just quietly seeded with what it needed. 6 months later, someone looked at the archived evidence, someone who had been developing the skills and contacts to use it, someone named Mira Len. I want to stop here and be honest with you about something before we go further into this particular chapter of what I was doing. What I was doing was not simple, not morally and not technically. Every answer I sent was a choice. Every choice had consequences I could not fully predict. Sometimes the choices were clear. The Inquisitor's prisoner, the starving border town, the general walking into an ambush he did not know was there. Sometimes they were the kind of thing that kept me awake past midnight wondering if I had understood the situation correctly or only thought I had. Cavan had asked if it was time for fire. I said no. What if the slow path cost more lives than the fast one he was offering? I did not know. I made the best calculation I had and lived with the uncertainty. This is the part nobody tells you about operating at scale. The dramatic version of power is decisive. You act, and something changes, and there is a clear before and after. The real version is that you act, and then you wait, and you do not know for years whether the choice was right, the dungeon maps were simpler, you either survived or you did not. Month 28, High Priest Vorden called a grand convocation, first one in 16 years, senior clergy from every province, every archbishop, the full High Council. I was assigned to help with the catering. The food was excellent. I ate very well that week and gathered more information than any meeting I had ever attended as a note-taker. The official outcome of the convocation, Arath had returned to active engagement with the faithful. The period of silence was declared a purification era now concluded. Vorden positioned himself as the leader whose tenure had created conditions favorable to divine communication. Nobody mentioned a junior initiate with a mop assignment. What I extracted from the closed sessions I was not attending. Vorden intended to insert the church formally into the succession process, using the renewed authority of the God's return. He had already chosen Dasha publicly, but he was planning to use the divine endorsement framing to establish precedent. The church blesses the heir, permanently, going forward. That meant every future succession would require the high priest's approval. Every future emperor would owe something to Vorden's office before they ever sat on the throne. Not a coup, subtler than that. The kind of institutional capture that takes decades to undo once it is established. The kind that looks like ceremony right up until it doesn't. I had 3 weeks before the convocation's formal declaration. Vorden's prayer was clear about the timeline. I needed to think carefully about whether to answer it and how. I decided to answer it. Not with the pressure I had used before, with something more specific. The full weight of accumulated trust again, but directed at one precise question. The precedent you are establishing, what happens to the faith in 50 years when the person in your position is not you? What does this look like when the office is occupied by someone less careful? I do not know if that is what changed his approach. I know that the formal declaration, when it came, did not include the succession precedent language he had originally drafted. Dasha received the endorsement, without conditions attached, without the language that would have made every future emperor a supplicant to the high priest's office before coronation. Vorden had stepped back from the edge of something, whether because of what I sent him or because of his own calculation of the risks. I cannot tell you for certain. Both are possible. People are not simple systems. They respond to pressure in ways that are not fully predictable even when you can hear their prayers. That night I knelt at the small altar in my cell and reached into the vessel the way I did every night now, as naturally as breathing, and listened. 28 months in. I could hold the connection for 12 hours now without physical damage. I knew the shape of the vessel, the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in long enough. I listened to the prayers come in. A farmer worried about an early frost and the timing of the harvest. A soldier somewhere in the north writing words in his head that he would send home when he got the chance. A child repeating words her mother had taught her, not yet sure what they meant, saying them because the meaning would arrive later and the practice was the preparation. Sarah of the Eastern Reach, 12 worshippers, 20 years in service, said simply, "Thank you. I don't know if you hear words or just something, but we made it through winter. Everyone." I sat with that for a long moment inside the distributed weight of 40 million people's accumulated hope, and something in me was very quiet. 21 years old, F-rank hunter, East Corridor, weekly mop assignment, the skill the system had rated at the very bottom of the scale, barely worth recording. And somewhere in the structure of what those 40 million people believed, something that might deserve the word light was keeping the candles burning in the dark. There was Vorden still to manage, Cavan in his role, archived evidence waiting for Mira, a succession steered but not finished, and things I could not yet see from where I was standing. But right now there was a farmer worried about frost, And I knew which irrigation report was sitting in the wrong official's queue, and getting that report to the right desk was what tonight was for. There was a farmer worried about frost, and a report in the wrong official's queue, and making that right was tonight's work. Let's get to it. Drop a comment below. Who do you think figures out the truth first? The high priest, the scholar, or someone nobody is expecting yet? Month 30. I had been Brother Kale for 2.5 years. My hands were calloused from the mop. My knees were permanently stiff from stone floors. And I was quietly running the largest empire on the continent from a room nobody visited twice. Not with orders and armies, with the small, invisible weight of 40 million prayers. Not running it the way an emperor runs it. Not orders and armies and public declarations. Quieter than that. Much quieter. The way a river runs a valley. You don't notice it's happening until you look at the shape of everything and realize the water made all of it. Dasha had been officially endorsed for the succession. The formal coronation would happen in 8 months when the emperor's condition worsened to the point that regency became necessary. She was already being briefed, already meeting with the council members who mattered, already being shaped, slowly, by the people around her who each had opinions about what kind of empress she should be. I watched this process through the vessel with the attention of someone who had spent 2 years learning which levers were real and which ones only looked like levers. Most of what the advisors were telling her was fine. Some of it was subtly self-serving. A few recommendations were genuinely dangerous, dressed up in reasonable language. When she prayed about a specific piece of advice she'd received, I answered her with the feeling of something that deserved a second look. Just that. She was smart. She looked. She found the problem herself every time. That was important. Not me solving it. Her solving it with her own mind, with a nudge that pointed her at the right door. I had learned something in 30 months. The difference between a puppet and a person is whether they understand why they are making the choices they make. Puppets follow strings. People follow reasoning. If I fed Dasha conclusions, she would be my puppet. If I pointed her at problems, she would become something the Empire actually needed. A ruler who solved her own problems and understood her own reasoning. That was the goal, not control. Something more durable than control. The thing I had not anticipated about living inside an empire's faith was how much I would start to hear things I did not want to hear and could not unhear. An empire at prayer is an empire with its guard down. People pray the way they think, not the way they talk. The distance between those two things is enormous. A senior bishop in the Western province prayed about a young priest he was slowly destroying through false accusations and institutional pressure, without once using any of those words. He framed it as concern, guidance, the need to correct a troubled soul. Every sentence was the language of care wrapped around the shape of cruelty. I had to sit with that for a long time before I understood what I was looking at, because the man believed his own framing. That was the worst part. The cruelest people in the vessel were rarely the ones who knew it. They had built such careful stories around themselves that they felt like the injured party in every situation. I could not reach into every one of them and fix it. I was not that kind of God, and this was not that kind of story. But I could redirect consequences. The young priest the bishop was destroying received a transfer to a position in the capital, requested, through channels, by a temple administrator who had heard good things. The administrator had not heard good things. The administrator had been nudged by a prayer I answered 6 weeks prior, nudged toward the thought that the Eastern appointments deserved a review. 3 steps removed, invisible. The young priest arrived in the capital with his career intact, and no idea that anything unusual had happened. I did not feel good in the simple way. Something more complicated settled in, the satisfaction of fixing a problem alongside the weight of having moved people through their lives without their knowledge. This was the part I had to keep thinking about, the ethics of it, not whether to do it, but what I was when I did. In month 31, I received a prayer I had not expected, from someone I had not expected to be praying at all. Mira Len, court scholar, the woman who had filed the petitions and found the documents and watched the war not happen without ever quite knowing how much of what she had done was her own. She was praying in her apartment late at night. Not formally, not kneeling, just sitting at her desk with her hands flat on a stack of papers. She said, "I think someone is using the faith as a mechanism. I think the recent run of unusually good outcomes from prayer has a human explanation. I do not know who or how. I'm going to find out." I stayed very still inside the vessel, which is a strange thing to say since I had no body in there. But there was a stillness that was the closest available word. Mira Len had spent her career finding things that were hidden in plain sight inside institutional documents. She had done it once with the supply contracts. She would do it again. The question was whether she could actually find me. The secondary and more uncomfortable question was what I intended to do about it if she did. I thought about this carefully over the next several days while mopping the corridor and tending the morning prayers and eating bread in the canteen. The options were avoid her, which was unlikely to work long-term with someone of her specific intelligence, mislead her, which felt wrong in a way I did not want to examine too closely, or find out what she would do with the truth, which was the terrifying option, and also the one I kept returning to. I had watched her for months through the vessel. I had seen how she thought, and what she valued, and what she did when she found something she had not expected to find. She was not the kind of person who used information as a weapon without thinking hard about whether to use it first. She was the kind of person who filed 7 documented petitions before trying anything else. I decided to trust it. Not blindly, not without reservation, but enough to let her get closer to the truth and see what she did when she reached it. She was methodical, Miralyn, the way a very good investigator is methodical, which means she did not move fast, but she did not miss things either. She started with a pattern. She pulled every documented report of unusual prayer experiences from the past 2.5 years and mapped them chronologically. Then she looked at the outcomes of the decisions made by the people who had reported the experiences, compared them to historical baseline rates for similar decisions. The outcome quality was statistically unusual, significantly better than chance, better than average, even for skilled decision makers operating in good conditions. She noted this, filed it, started looking at the second-order question: what would a human actor need to know and be able to do to produce this pattern? They would need access to the prayers, structural proximity to the faith, and enough subtlety that nobody had noticed for 3 years, which described someone very skilled and very well positioned. She noted this too, started building a list of people with access to the faith's institutional infrastructure: priests, archbishops, inquisitors, temple administrators. The list was long. She started narrowing it with what she knew about the timing. The pattern had begun approximately 2.5 years ago. Something had changed 2.5 years ago. I watched her work through the vessel in the evenings when she sat at her desk and thought through the problem out loud in the way scholars sometimes do, just below the level of actual prayer. She was getting close to the right question. Not the answer yet, but the question that pointed at the answer. I felt something that was almost admiration and almost anxiety at the same time. While Mira was narrowing her search toward me, something else was happening simultaneously that needed my attention considerably more urgently. Torvin, the brilliant and pitiless inquisitor, had been running his own investigation, not about me, about the source of the unusual doctrinal clarity appearing in church decisions for 2 years. Torvin was not a praying man in the usual sense. He did not kneel and make requests. He argued. His prayers were debates, conducted with the specific energy of a man who expected to be challenged back. He would lay out a doctrinal question, present his own answer, and then wait. If nothing arrived, he took it as confirmation. If a feeling arrived that complicated his answer, he argued with it. It was the most interesting mode of prayer I had encountered. He was not asking for guidance. He was asking for a sparring partner. His current case, Northern Province farmers praying communally without a priest, claiming direct experience of Orath's presence. The church called this unauthorized contact with the divine. The official church position was that this was irregular at minimum and potentially heretical. Unauthorized direct contact with the divine, bypassing the institutional structure of the faith. Torvin's own position was more complicated. He debated it to me late at night. If the divine presence is genuinely real, why would it restrict itself to officially approved institutional channels only? He was asking, in the most roundabout possible way, whether a real God would actually care about which forms you had filed before talking to it, whether the divine had opinions about bureaucracy. The honest answer was, yes, I did. And my opinion was that the farmers were doing something genuine and the official church was being defensive about its own relevance. But I could not say that directly. What I sent him was the feeling of a question that deserved more investigation before a verdict. The specific intellectual discomfort of a case that does not have the shape of an obvious answer. Torvin, being who he was, took this as a challenge. He went north personally to investigate. He spent 2 weeks with the farming community. He came back and wrote a 30-page analysis arguing that communal lay prayer fell within permissible doctrine, and that the community should be officially recognized rather than prosecuted. Borden read this analysis with the expression of a man being handed something he could not argue with and did not like. He approved it. The farming community was officially recognized. Their practice became a documented precedent. Within 3 years, communities like theirs were appearing in 6 provinces. I had not planned that specifically, but Torvin's rigorous mind had taken the small opening I offered and built something real out of it. That was the best version of what I could do. Month 34. Something went wrong in a way I had not anticipated, and probably should have. Looking back at it from a position of slightly more experience, a young priest named Bren had been at the Third Temple for about 6 months. He was sincere, genuinely devout, worked hard, believed completely. He had also started having his own prayer experiences, genuine ones, not the kind I generated. His own, the kind that came from sustained attention and real faith focus to a point. These experiences were rarer than people assumed. The vessel was large and old and complex. Most prayers touched its surface and dispersed. Occasionally, someone pressed long enough to hit something real below. Bren had hit something real. He was interpreting it as personal divine communication, which, in a limited sense, it was, just not from any intelligence, more like touching live current. But he was building a theology around it, an ecstatic theology, the kind that produces prophets and movements and institutional disruption in roughly equal measure throughout history. He had started telling the other junior initiates about his experiences. They were listening with the open-eyed attention of young people who want very much for something to be true. If I did nothing, in approximately 6 months, Bren would have a following inside the Third Temple. In 18 months, that following would be visible enough to trigger the Inquisition's attention. Torvin would probably find the experiences genuine. But institutional reactions to a young prophet inside the church's walls would cause damage regardless of what Torvin concluded about authenticity. I sat with the problem for a full week, thought it through from every angle I could find. Then I answered Bren's next prayer in a way I had not done for anyone else. Not with information, not with a directional nudge. With presence, the full weight of the vessel focused down to the size of one person's prayer. Bren had been experiencing something real but partial, the way touching the edge of a large thing gives you a partial impression of it. I let him feel the whole scale of it. For about 30 seconds, he sat in his cell with his hands shaking and tears running down his face and the full weight of 300 years of 40 million people's hope pressing against his mind. Then I pulled it back to the edge again. Just the edge. What he had been touching before. He sat there for a very long time afterward. The next day, he went to Sister Vale, an older senior priest, and asked her how you lived with knowing something that vast existed without immediately trying to make everyone else understand it. Sister Vael had been in the priesthood for 30 years. She told him the difference between a prophet and a fool was usually patience. The thing worth saying was worth waiting until it could be said correctly. Bren listened. He slowed down. He stopped proselytizing to the other initiates. He started writing instead, carefully in a private journal. What he was writing would matter later, but not yet, and not in the way that damaged the institution he lived inside. I had bought time and redirected something that could have become damaging. Whether what I had done to Bren directly was right was a harder and more uncomfortable question. Month 36. 3 years inside the priesthood. 3 years inside the vessel, which meant 3 years of being the sky that 40 million people aimed their hope toward. The nosebleeds had stopped. 18 hours in the vessel, no physical effects beyond fatigue, and the F-rank label felt like something written on a river when it was still a small puddle in the dirt. But the skill was not what had changed most significantly. What had changed most was what I understood about power and how it actually worked at scale. In a dungeon, you kill the monster and the dungeon is clear. The outcome is visible and immediate and unambiguous. That is a clean kind of work, nothing like dungeon work. Every action rippled outward. The farmer's report helped his children grow up stable. One became an administrator, who affected 50,000 people over 20 years. I was not tracking those chains. I could not. The vessel gave me information about the present, not the future. I was working in the dark the way everyone works, just with better information about right now. But better information about right now was not nothing. It was nearly everything. The gap between knowing what people actually believed and not knowing it was the gap between effective and useless. What the vessel gave me was not omniscience, it was honesty. The honest interior of an empire at prayer was very different from the public face of an empire going about its business. People prayed for what they would never say aloud. So I knew what was actually feared, what was really wanted, what was happening beneath the institutional language that covered the empire like a second skin. And with that honesty, I could work. Carefully, slowly. One irrigation report, one misrouted document, one feeling of settled certainty pressing down on one person at one moment of genuine uncertainty. 3 years? And the empire was slightly better than it had been. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would make the historians write about it. But the 30,000 soldiers were still alive. The farming community in the north was worshipping without fear. Dasha was being prepared honestly for the throne she was going to sit on. Those things had not happened by accident or luck or good governance. They had happened because someone was listening. And nobody in the empire knew that someone was listening. Month 38. Miralyn arrived at the Third Temple on a Tuesday morning with a scholar's access credential and a very specific set of questions she intended to answer. She came as a researcher requesting access to the historical archive. The church maintained extensive documentation going back centuries, technically open to qualified scholars with the right credentials. She had clearance through her position at court. Brother Aldrich processed her access request. He sent me a look across the entry hall that communicated several things without words. I nodded once at Aldrich across the entry hall, communicating several things without words, and went back to the corridor. My mop and I had our usual morning to get through. Mira spent 4 days in the archive. I did not watch her work directly because watching her through the vessel felt more invasive than I was comfortable with. But I could hear her thinking. Not the words exactly. The shape of concentration when someone is very close to something. On the 4th day, she came out of the archive late in the afternoon. She stopped in the main hall, looking at the altar. She said quietly to the temple air, "I know you can hear this. I'm not going to do anything with what I find until I understand it properly. That is not a threat. That is just how I work. Not a prayer by any definition she would accept. But it reached me through the vessel the same way prayers did, which said something about how the mechanism worked underneath the theology. I thought about it all evening. Then, after the night service, I went to find her in the scholars' reading room. She was still there, still working. She looked up when I knocked on the open door. She was in the small scholars' reading room off the archive, still working. She looked up when I knocked on the open door. A junior priest with a mop, which is not an alarming sight in any temple. I said, "Researcher Lin, there is something I think you should see, and I want to be the one who shows it to you directly. It is going to take a while to explain properly." She looked at me for a moment. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent a long time learning to read situations quickly. She said, "All right, sit down." I sat down. I thought about where to start. And then I started at the beginning with the registration office and the F-rank stamp and the stone golem and the D-rank dungeon. She listened without interrupting. She was very good at listening. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She said, "How long has this been happening?" 3 years and 2 months. She wrote it down without visible reaction, which told me she had already been close to that estimate. She absorbed this. Then, "How many people know?" I said 1. She said, "I make 2? She wrote that down as well and looked back at me steadily, waiting for what came next. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this now, directly, instead of letting me find it on my own? What does telling me serve for you? Because you were going to find it eventually, and I would rather you find it from me directly than construct a partial version that might lead you to the wrong conclusions." She thought about this too. She had the quality of actually thinking before responding rather than reacting. Particularly useful in someone who had just learned what she had about the past 3 years. She said, "What you have been doing, the decisions you have influenced, have you been steering outcomes toward a specific political objective? No, toward better outcomes for the people at the bottom of the decisions, the ones who do not have access to the people making the decisions. I'm not trying to build anything for myself." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "That is exactly what someone doing the other thing would say. I know, I cannot prove it to you with anything more convincing than my word and the pattern of outcomes. I can show you the record and let you evaluate it yourself." She said, "Show me the record." We spent the rest of the night going through it. The irrigation report, the Inquisitor's prisoner, the general before the ambush, the war that did not happen. All of it. She listened. She asked precise questions. She did not accept any of it on face value. She followed every thread to its outcome and checked my account of the outcome against the records she had access to. Around 3 a.m., she put down her pen and looked out the window at the dark courtyard where the processional candles had long since been extinguished. She sat like that for a while. She said, "You have been doing this for 3 years, and you haven't consolidated any power for yourself. You are still mopping a corridor?" "Yes." She said, "That is either the most convincing evidence that you are what you say you are, or you are operating on a much longer timeline than I am able to see." "Also possible," I said. She almost smiled at that. The kind of almost smile that contains several complicated emotions at once. Then she said, "What do you need from me, if anything?" I thought about it. "Nothing yet. I told you because you would have found it, and because I think what is coming is going to need more than one person thinking about it." "What is coming?" "I do not know exactly. But the vessel is large enough that I can feel the weight of what is pressing against the edges of the Empire from outside. And some of that weight is not natural." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to be clear that I'm not agreeing to anything. I'm agreeing to think about it." "That is enough," I said. I went back to the east corridor and the remainder of the night. She went back to her notes. Neither of us slept much before the morning bells started up. Month 40. The formal coronation of Dasha as regent had been officially announced to the provinces. 8 weeks away, which in political terms is almost no time at all. The emperor was not dying dramatically. He was diminishing, the way old men sometimes do, slowly and then suddenly. The council had determined that the regency transition should happen before the suddenly part. The political environment was complicated. Aaron's family had accepted the endorsement publicly while not stopping privately. Folt's supporters in the military provinces were making significant noise. And someone had started a rumor, a specific and targeted one, the kind with a particular shape that tells you it did not appear by accident and is being actively maintained, The rumor said the divine endorsement was manufactured. The god had not returned. 3 years of apparent communication from the divine were the work of a political actor inside the church serving Dasha. The rumor was more accurate than the people spreading it understood, but the conclusion it was pointing toward was wrong. I was not working for any faction. Good governance favored the prepared candidate, not bias. That was what honest examination produced. Rumors do not carry footnotes explaining the difference, they just travel. But rumors do not carry footnotes. They do not distinguish between the accurate part and the inaccurate conclusion drawn from the accurate part. They just travel. It was spreading through the court and the merchant classes and the outer provinces with the specific velocity of something being actively pushed rather than naturally traveling. Someone was spending resources on this. Someone with reach and coordination and an interest in destabilizing the succession. Mira found the origin point in 12 days. That was fast by any standard. She was extremely good at this particular kind of work and had clearly been practicing. 3 apparently independent sources, 2 intermediary contacts, 1 origin, a Gao merchant consortium, 4 years of military buildup, now buying political disruption at the exact moment of the succession, the same territories that had been quietly building military capacity for the past 4 years, the same territories the postponed Eastern campaign had been targeting. The war had not happened. The people who had invested in making the war happen had not profited, and now, 3 years later, they were investing in a different kind of destabilization. Not an army, a rumor, a legitimacy crisis timed for the succession moment. An empire distracted by internal questions about its own divine mandate, weakened exactly when a prepared neighbor was ready to move. I sat with the full shape of it for 2 days, turning it over, checking the connections, making sure I had the right picture. Then I went to find Torvin. The Inquisitor Torvin had an office in the east wing of the temple complex, 3 doors down from my corridor. I had mopped past it approximately 400 times. I had never gone in. There's a natural reluctance to knock on the door of someone whose professional role involves determining whether people are heretics. But I knocked. He looked up from his papers. He was a sharp-faced man in his 50s, the kind of sharp that came from decades of looking at things until he understood them. He looked at me from behind his desk, a junior priest at the door of the Inquisitor's office, which was not a usual combination. He said, "Yes?" with the tone of someone deciding how impatient to be. I said, "I have information about the source of the succession rumors. I would like to share it without it being clear how I obtained it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Close the door." I closed the door and sat down without being explicitly invited. He noted this and filed it. Then I laid out the Gao consortium, the funding trace, and the timing relative to the succession announcement. I told him about the merchant consortium, the funding traces, the connection to the Gao military buildup. I did not explain how I knew. I said I had a source that I was not in a position to name. He listened with a particular quality of attention that meant he was evaluating everything simultaneously. Not just what I was saying, how I was saying it, what I was leaving out. When I finished, he said this would need independent verification. I said the documentary trail existed. Someone with court access to trade intelligence records could verify it in approximately 2 weeks. He said, "Someone like your source?" "Yes," I said. He paused. Then he asked if I was the thing that had been answering the prayers. I looked at him. He looked back with the expression of someone who had already formed an answer and wanted confirmation. I said, "That is a complicated question to answer simply. Complicated questions have yes or no underneath," he said. I said yes. He was quiet. 2 years of arguments, he said. Yes? He won more than expected. You raised good points? He asked what I needed. He said, "Someone like your source." I said yes. He looked at me for a moment, then set his pen down and asked me a question I had been expecting someone to ask for 3 years. He said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to consider it seriously before answering. Are you the thing that has been answering the prayers?" I looked at him. He looked at me with the expression of someone who had already formed the answer and wanted to hear if I would confirm it. I said, "That is a complicated question to answer directly." He said, "I have noticed that complicated questions tend to arrive with complicated answers that are nonetheless clearly yes or no underneath the complexity." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a very long time. Outside the window, the morning bells were starting from the distant South Temple. I need the rumor investigated and its source exposed before the coronation. I need it done through legitimate channels so the outcome is defensible. I cannot do that from the East Corridor. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he reached for a fresh sheet of paper. He said, "I will need 4 weeks and access to the trade records." 3 weeks, I said. "The coronation is in 8. He said, 3 weeks. "You should be aware that if I find evidence that contradicts what you have told me, I will follow that evidence wherever it leads." I said, "I know that. It is exactly why I came to you instead of someone else." someone who would follow the evidence wherever it led, was the only person I could trust with this. Torvin was precise and fast. Mira's 12-day trace had given him the map. He had the institutional authority to pull threads Mira couldn't reach. In 3 weeks, he had a documented case. The funding sources, the intermediary contacts, the campaign of deliberate disinformation, all of it traceable and evidenced. He brought it to Vorden with a written report and a very specific face. The face of a man delivering information that is going to be uncomfortable and has already decided he does not care. Vorden read the report. His expression cycled through several things. At the end, it settled on something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The succession crisis had a foreign origin, which meant it was not a crisis of the faith's legitimacy. It was an attack on the Empire from outside. Those were two very different political situations. Vorden called an emergency High Council session. The Council summoned the Emperor's intelligence office, which had its own Gao surveillance data in pieces that fit exactly with Torvin's documented case. The rumor campaign was publicly named foreign interference. Origins disclosed. Mechanisms explained in enough detail that the manipulation became visible. Visible manipulation loses almost all of its power. The political environment around the succession did not calm down completely. These things never calm down completely. But the specific attack that had been running for 6 weeks was neutralized. The coronation date held, which was the point of the whole exercise. Not the exposure of the Gao funding, not Torvin's documented case, just that the date held and the transition happened. I mopped the east corridor on the morning of the announcement. Aldrich passed me on his way to the main hall. He did not say anything. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder and kept walking. Dasha's coronation as regent happened on a cold morning in early winter. I was assigned to hold a ceremonial torch in the third row of the processional, 40,000 people in the temple square. The great bells of Orath ringing from the tower, the sound was so large it pressed against your chest from the inside. She walked through the center of it with the specific quality she had shown in her prayers. Not performing the moment, living inside it, paying attention, understanding what it cost and what it asked of her. When the high priest raised his hands and invoked Orath's blessing over the new regent, I reached into the vessel. I found her prayer from 2 nights before, still present in the way strong prayers sometimes remained. She had said, "I do not know if I am ready. I know I am the one who is going to try." I had not answered that prayer when she sent it. Some things do not need an answer from the outside. They just need the weight of being witnessed by something that is paying attention. I pressed the weight of 40 million people's hope against the moment, not as a message, just as presence, the accumulated faith of 3 centuries meeting one woman who was prepared to take it seriously. Whatever she felt in that moment, I cannot tell you precisely. I saw her close her eyes for 1 second longer than the ceremony required. Then she opened her eyes, and the regent of Selene lifted her chin and began the work that would define the shape of the next 30 years of the Empire's life. That night I sat in my small stone cell for a long time without reaching into the vessel, just sitting there in the ordinary weight of my own body, which I rarely noticed anymore. I was thinking about something that Mira had said in one of our conversations in the scholars' reading room. She had asked me what I was going to do when I could not do this anymore. I had not understood what she meant when she said it. I told her the skill did not seem to be declining, that I could hold the vessel longer now than when I started. She said, "That is not what I mean. I mean when it stops being something you can do quietly from a corridor, when the scale of what you need to do requires you to be visible." I had not had a good answer to that question when she asked it, and sitting in my cell on the night of the coronation, I still did not have one that satisfied me. The vessel was growing. More people were praying. The faith was spreading into provinces that had been skeptical a generation ago. The size of the thing I was inside was increasing every year. The pressures at the Empire's edges were not decreasing. The Gao territories neutralized for now, but not resolved. The unusual eastern trade route reports Torvin had mentioned once, carefully and offhandedly. Unusual reports. The specific phrase a careful person uses when they have seen something they do not yet have a category for. I was going to need categories for things that did not have categories yet, and I was going to need to develop them fast enough to be useful before the things arrived. 3 years of mopping a corridor, 3 years of quiet work in the small spaces between other people's decisions. I was not sure that was going to be sufficient for what was coming. I was not sure what would be sufficient. I was going to find out. Brother Aldrich knocked on my door at 10 that night. He had 2 cups of something hot from the kitchen. He sat on the floor because there was only 1 chair and gave me the chair. He said the regent had looked well today. I agreed. She had. He asked if I was all right, with the tone of someone who already suspected the answer was more complicated than fine. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm thinking about scale, about whether the thing I have been doing can stay the size it has been." He asked if it could stay the same size. "Probably not forever," I said, and that was honest enough that he did not press for more. He handed me the hot drink from the kitchen instead. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "When the time comes to be bigger, you will figure it out. You figured out the vessel. You will figure out the next thing. This was not a sophisticated analysis, but it was said with the specific conviction of someone who had decided to believe something and was not going to be moved from it. I drank the hot drink. It was the good kind, the kind from the small kitchen that the senior priests got and occasionally shared. Aldrich had brought the good kind from the senior priest's kitchen because it was a significant day and he had decided that significant days should be marked by the better quality of available beverage. Outside the window, the bells of the evening service were finishing. The city was settling towards sleep. Somewhere in the temple square, the processional torches were being extinguished one by one. 40 million people had prayed today, some for the new regent, some for their farms and families and the ordinary, unremarkable things that made up the actual texture of a civilization. And I had heard all of it. The weight of it was familiar now, the way any large thing becomes familiar when you have been holding it long enough. I thought about the irrigation report, about Sarah saying thank you to a god she was not sure existed, about 30,000 soldiers alive somewhere doing ordinary things, because one campaign had not happened. I thought about what was coming from the east now, not soldiers, something else, something the trade route reports were describing in language that kept not quite fitting. I put down the cup and reached into the vessel, the familiar weight of 40 million prayers settling around me like water rising to shoulder level. I started listening for the thing I needed to find. There was a merchant in the border city of Verath, a man who traded in information as much as goods, who had been praying to Orath for the first time in his adult life. He was praying because he did not know what else to do. He had seen something on the Eastern Road 2 weeks ago, and his usual categories for making sense of the world had stopped working. He said, I don't know if anyone hears this, but something is wrong on the Eastern Road. I have no category for what I saw out there. 20 years on those roads, and I have never run out of categories before. I listened to what he described on the Eastern Road with full attention. The shape of it did not fit any category I had either. That was, by itself, the most alarming piece of information in the prayer. Then I brought the vessel's full attention to bear on the Eastern roads. And I started thinking carefully about what you do when something breaks all existing categories and is moving westward. The thing on the Eastern Road was the beginning of the next chapter of this story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That is not where we are yet in the sequence of events. Month 42. The Regent has been governing for 2 months. Torvin is quietly investigating the Eastern reports. Mira is building what she refuses to call a spy network, but that is exactly what it is. And I am Brother Kale, 3rd rank now, corridor assignment unchanged by my own deliberate request, still the most invisible person in the most powerful institution in the Empire. Aldrich has started calling me the most dangerous mop in the history of the faith. He says this quietly, and only when no one else can hear. He thinks it is very funny. He is not wrong about the mop, but there is nothing funny yet about what is moving toward us from the east, and I expect that to become apparent to more people fairly soon. A merchant who has been on those roads for 20 years does not pray to a god he does not believe in unless he has seen something that broke his categories completely. I do not know what broke his categories on that road. I know it is moving westward. I know the faith of 40 million people will either be the best tool I have for facing it or the worst liability. The difference between those outcomes is what I do in the next 12 months. The East Corridor, the mop. 40 million prayers and something coming from the east that breaks categories. Let's get to work. Month 43. The merchant's name was Halef. I found him through the vessel 3 days after his prayer, and I needed to speak with him in person. This was a new problem. I had been working through distance and prayer for 3 years. Speaking to someone in person meant leaving the temple, which Brother Kale technically could do. 3rd rank initiates were permitted to travel on church business, and the question was, what counted as church business? I asked Torvin. He looked at me across his desk with the expression he used when I had said something that was going to require him to do additional paperwork and said, approved. He did not ask what the business was. He had developed a working method for our collaboration that involved not asking certain questions and trusting that the answers would be evident in the outcomes. I appreciated this more than I had expected to. It was the most efficient version of trust I had yet encountered in 3 years of working inside the institution. I went to Aldrich next. He was in the East Corridor with his own mop, covering for me while I arranged the travel. He had started doing this without being asked. He said, how long? I said, 2 weeks probably. He nodded and kept mopping. He had a gift for not making things more complicated than they needed to be. Verath was a border city, 3 days east of Selene by road, which in the Empire's geography meant it was at the edge of where the church's administrative reach was reliable. The faith was present in Verath. Temples, priests, the full structure. But it felt different here, thinner, more practical. Border city prayers had a different texture than capital ones. Capital prayers were often about status and the management of advantage. Border prayers were more often about survival, crops, safety, whether the person praying would still be alive in 6 months. I noticed this distinction more sharply when physically present in Verath. The The city smelled like river mud and merchant goods and the exhaustion of somewhere that could change hands politically without warning. Halev's trading post was in the market district. Low building, well maintained. He was a lean man in his 50s, with the face of someone who had spent decades outside in variable weather and variable politics. He looked at me when I arrived and said, "You are not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" He said, "Something bigger. A sign, at least. Something with the decency to be dramatic." I told him I was not dramatic by preference. He laughed once, briefly, and poured 2 cups of something. We sat down. He said, "I don't actually believe in Orath. I want to be clear about that. I prayed because I ran out of other things to do, and it felt like the least stupid of the remaining options." I said, "That is a reasonable basis for prayer." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "All right, what I saw was this. The eastern road through the Kal Pass had been a trade route for 4 centuries. Halev had traveled it twice a year for 22 years, and knew every village and way station along it. 6 weeks ago, the road was normal. 3 weeks ago, everything east of the Kal summit was wrong. His word, used carefully, the way a man uses words when he understands precision matters. Not attacked, not destroyed. Wrong. His word for it, and he used it carefully, like a man who understood that imprecise language was a problem in his profession. The villages were still there. The buildings stood. The people were present. But the people were not behaving the way people behave. They were moving in patterns that felt automated. His word again, automated. He demonstrated with his hands a particular quality of motion that was purposeful, but without the small variations and hesitations that human movement had. The animals were worse. They moved in formation, not the formation of herded animals, something more precise, more directed, as if they were implementing a plan rather than responding to a handler, and the light was wrong. He said this last. The specific quality of light in that region had changed. He could not tell me how exactly, because he did not have the technical vocabulary for optics. What he could tell me was that it was the kind of wrong that made experienced travelers turn around without deciding to turn around. Your body made the decision for you before your mind caught up. He had turned around, not ashamed of it. He said, "I know fear from the inside. This was not fear. This was my body understanding something my mind did not have a category for yet." I sat with this for a while. Halev refilled both cups. Outside the window, a cart went by on the cobblestones. I said, "Did you see anything else? Anything specific?" He thought about it. Then he said, "There was a sound, not audible exactly, more like the memory of a sound, the kind you hear in a very old building that is remembering some past vibration." He said, "The whole valley was doing that, remembering something." I said, "How far east of the summit did this begin?" He gave me the distance and then drew the map I asked for. He said, "The villages I am describing are a day's ride past the summit, but I could feel the change starting maybe an hour past it, earlier if you were paying attention." He said, "I'm going to ask you something." "You do not have to answer." I said, "Ask." He said, "Is this something that can be stopped?" I said, "I do not know yet. Things that can be understood can be responded to." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That is the most honest answer anyone has given me in 3 weeks, and I appreciate it. Now I'm going to take you to meet someone else." The someone else was a woman named Deet. She lived in the market district in a room above a tanner's workshop, which meant the entire building smelled like a particular kind of industry. Deet was perhaps 30 years old, with the quality of attention of someone who had been observing things carefully for a long time and drawing conclusions that most people did not want to hear. She said, when Halev introduced me, "You are the one he prayed to." I said, "In a sense." She said, "Good," because she had been trying to figure out how to reach the faith for 3 weeks. She said, "Good. I have been trying to figure out how to reach the faith for 3 weeks. I have a lot of observations and nowhere useful to send them." Deet was a naturalist. She studied animal behavior. She had been doing fieldwork in the eastern valleys for 6 months and had been present when the change started. She had not fled. She had retreated to a safe observation distance and started documenting everything she could reach without going back into the affected area. What she had documented was extensive. 12 notebooks, drawings, specimen samples from animals that had died at the boundary of the affected area and been recovered from outside it. She said the specimens were the important part. The specimens were preserved in small glass jars, fragments of tissue from birds and rodents collected within 100 meters of the affected zone boundary. Under normal circumstances, the tissue would look like tissue. It did not look like tissue. It looked like it had been taken apart and reassembled by something that understood the shape, but not the material. I had never seen anything like this. I had read everything available about unusual biological phenomena in the church's archive, and nothing I had read described what Deet was showing me. She said, "Whatever is doing this has a mechanism. It is operating on physical matter in a systematic way. It is not random damage, it is conversion." I said, "Converting what into what?" She said she did not know yet. That was what she needed the laboratory to determine, but the pattern was consistent. Every specimen showed the same underlying structure. She said, "Whatever is doing this is doing it the same way every time. Every specimen shows the same underlying structure in the converted tissue. A consistent mechanism, not random damage. Conversion," I said, "a mechanism doing the same thing every time can be interrupted." She looked at me sharply and said, "Yes, that is exactly what I have been thinking." But she needed resources to figure out how. I said, "What if I could arrange that?" She said, "How?" I said the church had a research archive in Selene with equipment and scholars. If I brought her there as a research fellow, it was within my authority. She said, "I'm not religious." I said, "Neither was the last person I recruited for something like this. The last person being Mira Len, court scholar, also not religious, currently building a spy network." 3 days later, I was back in Selene with Deet. 3 weeks of her documentation, 12 notebooks, and a collection of specimen jars that required special handling to transport. Mira met us at the temple gate with the expression of someone who had already started restructuring her plans to accommodate a new variable. Mira met us at the gate and looked at the jars. She said, "Are those safe?" Deet said, "Probably." The conversion appeared to stop at death. Once the organism stopped living, the mechanism lost interest in it. Mira said, "You said probably." Deet said, "I work with observed data. Probably is as certain as I can be about things I have not yet fully characterized. I introduced them properly." They looked at each other with a specific recognition of two people who are very good at different things and can see the usefulness of the other. Mira said, "I have been building an information network. I have contacts in the border provinces and in the Gao territories. I can get you eyewitness reports from the eastern areas if that helps." Deet said it would help enormously. I left them to begin working together. The orchestration was the skill I was learning, not the doing. Identify capable people and create conditions where they could work. Meanwhile, the vessel had been telling me something about the eastern situation that I had not yet shared with anyone. The prayers from the eastern border provinces had been changing, not in content exactly, in texture, the same quality I had noticed in Halev's prayer before I understood what I was looking at. A specific bewilderment, farmers asking why their animals behaved strangely, mothers why children seemed different, merchants reporting routes that felt unsafe without being able to say why. None of them used the word conversion. They did not have that word for what they were experiencing, but the shape of what they were describing was consistent with what Deet had documented. And underneath the bewilderment, something else, something I had to listen carefully to separate from the general noise of the vessel. Some prayers from the eastern areas were not bewildered at all, they were satisfied. The specific texture of relief, of having something long unresolved finally answered, not to Orath, to something else. These were not prayers asking for help, these were prayers of thanks. And they were thanking something that was not Orath. That was the part that made me sit very still for a very long time. There was a second vessel, not like mine, not accumulated human faith, something older and different on a different principle entirely. But it was receiving prayers. People were directing their hope toward it, and it was responding to them in ways that they experienced as answers. Which meant whatever was converting the eastern region was not simply consuming, it was also offering. It had something to give to the people who accepted what it offered. That was a very different threat than a simple invasion, an invasion you could oppose. Something that offered people something they wanted was more complicated. Because you had to understand what it was offering before you could offer something better, and I was not sure yet that what it was offering could be matched. Month 45. I brought Torvin and Mira together for the first time. Torvin looked at Mira like an undeclared problem. Mira looked at Torvin like institutional authority, useful until proven otherwise. I told them both what I had found in the vessel, the changing prayer texture from the eastern provinces, the prayers of satisfaction directed at something that was not Orath. Torvin was quiet after I finished. He said, "A competing divine presence." I said, "Not exactly divine, but something functioning similarly from the perspective of the people interacting with it." I said, "Not exactly divine, but something that functions similarly to a divine presence from the perspective of the people interacting with it." Mira said, "It is offering them something." "What?" I said, "I did not know yet, but whatever it was, it appeared tailored to each individual. Each satisfaction prayer had a slightly different character." I said, "I do not know yet, but it is tailored to them. Each prayer of satisfaction has a slightly different character. Whatever it is offering, it appears to be responding to what the individual actually wants." Torvin said, "That is more sophisticated than I expected from a physical conversion process." I said Deet believed the physical and spiritual operations were the same mechanism on different levels. The physical conversion affected matter. The spiritual offering affected belief and desire. Both were the same mechanism. Deet had been right about the consistency. It was doing the same thing at every level. Mira said, "It is converting people the way it converts tissue, but more slowly and more gently, because it needs willing converts more than it needs forced ones." The room was quiet for a moment. Torvin asked how far west the conversion zone had reached. I said the documented boundary was 2 days east of Vareth, but the spiritual reach extended into the Kalfoot Hills. I said the documented boundary is 2 days east of Varath, but the spiritual reach is wider. Prayers of satisfaction have come from areas as far west as the Kalfoot Hills. Mira said, it is ahead of its physical expansion. It offers before it converts. And then the people who accept the offering become the vectors for the physical mechanism. She was already writing it down. Which means the physical conversion follows the spiritual one. The people who accept the offering become the vectors for the physical mechanism. Torvin put down his pen. He said, this is a significantly larger problem than I anticipated when we began this conversation. That is why I wanted both of you in the same room together. Mira looked at me and said, what do you need from us? Tell us what you need, and we will tell you what we can actually do. I told Mira I needed the information network expanded into the spiritual territory, which communities were experiencing satisfaction prayers and at what density, overlaid with Diet's physical conversion map. She was already writing before I finished the sentence. This was becoming a pattern with Mira. She required only enough of a sentence to understand the direction of the rest. For Torvin, I needed him to understand what the competing presence was offering in theological terms. Fighting it required knowing what it was. He was the only one who could go east and return with that. He said, I will need access to the eastern area. Personal access. I need to speak with the people who are experiencing the satisfaction prayers. I said, I know. That is the part I am not comfortable with. But I think you are the only person I have who can do it safely. He said, I am the Inquisitor. I have been uncomfortable before. He said it so flatly that it was almost funny. Almost. While Torvin prepared his Eastern survey and Mira expanded her network, something happened in the capital that needed my attention. Regent Dasha had been governing for 3 months. By every measure, she was doing it well. Considered decisions, expert consultants, reforms that would take longer to show results, but produce more durable ones. She was also beginning to attract the specific kind of opposition that effective governance always generates. People who had benefited from the previous arrangements that her reforms were changing. And one of those people had decided to go directly at the divine legitimacy question again, not with a Gao-funded rumor campaign this time, something more personal. A senior court official named Brennick had commissioned a treatise arguing the divine endorsement of Dasha was valid at the time but no longer binding, since Orath had not confirmed it since the coronation. It was technically sophisticated. It engaged with genuine doctrinal questions about the duration and conditions of divine endorsements. It cited real historical precedents. It was also, structurally, a move toward requiring the Church to continuously validate the Regent's divine endorsement, or have that endorsement treated as expired, which would give whoever controlled the Church's validation process enormous leverage over the Regent, permanently, going forward. I read the treatise through Mira's intelligence network. I thought about it for 3 days, then I answered Vorden's prayer. He had been praying about the treatise, not asking for guidance, more like talking through the problem the way he sometimes did, working out his own position by explaining it to something larger. His working position. The treatise was technically valid in some arguments, politically dangerous, and needed a response that closed the doctrinal question permanently rather than opening it for further debate. I agreed with his analysis. I sent him the sense that the response needed to engage with the precedents on their own terms and establish a principle more durable than the specific question Brennick had raised. He sat with that for 2 days. Then he commissioned a response from the Church's senior theological scholars, 6 of them working simultaneously on different aspects of the doctrinal question. The response took 5 weeks. It was long and thorough. It established as formal doctrine that divine endorsements in succession questions were permanent and unconditional, citing 12 centuries of precedent. Vorden added an appendix himself. Questions about ongoing divine confirmation were evidence of misunderstanding how divine communication worked. Absence of repetition was not withdrawal. That was its nature. The God speaks when it speaks, the appendix said. Absence of continuous confirmation is not withdrawal. Divine communication given at the moment of need does not require repetition to remain valid. Vorden had written that himself, without asking me. It was not entirely theologically accurate, but it was politically effective and practically useful, and I was not going to correct it. I did add one thing, through the vessel, to Dasha directly, on the night before the official response was published. Not a message about the treatise, a message about the opposition itself. I sent her a particular truth. The people opposing you are telling you something important, not about you, about what needs to change. Intensity of opposition maps the scale of interests being threatened. She wrote something in her journal that night. She wrote, the opposition is a map. Follow it to what needs fixing and fix those things harder. That was Dasha. That was exactly the mind the Empire was going to need on the throne for the next 30 years. I was glad she was there. Month 48. Torvin returned from the east, looking like a man who had been given a much larger set of measurements than his instruments were designed to handle. He sat down across from me in his office. He said, "I spoke with 47 people in 12 communities east of the Kal foothills who have experienced what you called the satisfaction prayers." I said, "And?" He clarified, "Not sleep, not death. Something they described as resolution." A long, tormenting question finally answered at the level where it was being asked. Every person he spoke with had a different, specific resolution. For some, it was grief. For others, a question about their own nature. For some, simply the weight of continuous scarcity and uncertainty. What the offering targeted was not desire in the usual sense. It was not giving things they wanted. It was removing what they carried. The burdens, the unresolved questions, the grief that did not leave. I said, "And after the offering, what happens to the people who accept it?" He said that was the part he needed to tell me carefully because it was not what he had expected. He said, "The people who accept the offering are functional. They are not distressed. They are not behaving in ways that appear involuntary. They make choices that appear to be genuine choices." He said, "But they are no longer praying to Allrath. They are not praying to anything. The need that prayers respond to, the specific human experience of incompleteness and yearning, it appears to be gone." I said, "The conversion removes the need to pray." He said, "Yes. And without that need, the faith had no purchase. The vessel lost its connection to these people entirely." The room was quiet for a long time. I said, "It is not converting them, it is completing them." He said, "Yes, that was the right word, and that was why it was more dangerous than any invasion he could think of." I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cell and reached into the vessel and listened to the Eastern prayers. The satisfied ones were more numerous than a month ago. The bewildered ones were fewer. At current rates, the satisfaction prayers would outnumber the bewildered ones within 3 months. Within 6 months, the eastern provinces would have lost enough connection to the vessel to be outside my reach. And once people were outside my reach, I had nothing. I was a junior priest with a mop. The vessel was everything I had. Without it, I was just a person in a room listening to silence. I thought about what Torvin had said. You cannot liberate people from something they experienced as liberation. I thought about it carefully. The farmers who had been completed, the merchants who had accepted the offering, were they actually better off? The grief was gone. The unresolved questions were resolved, but they were also no longer praying, which meant they were no longer part of the collective vessel of 40 million people's hope, which meant the vessel was contracting. And a contracted vessel was a smaller lever. A smaller lever meant less reach. Less reach meant I could do less for the people who still needed what I could do. This was the shape of the problem, not an invasion to redirect or a rumor to expose, a mechanism that genuinely helped people and in helping them reduced the pool of people I could help others through. The only possible response was to offer something the completion mechanism structurally could not offer. I spent 3 nights finding the answer. I listened to the satisfied prayers and the bewildered ones and the ordinary ones from the capital and farming provinces. And on the 3rd night, I found the answer in a prayer from a woman in the capital. She had been using Allrath as a thinking partner for 20 years, not asking for anything, working through a problem about her daughter. She said, "You never tell me what to do, but explaining helps me think," and she explained the problem with her daughter. The specific texture of their relationship, the things that were difficult and the things that were not, the history underneath the present difficulty. I listened to her explain the problem with her daughter, and I understood this is what the completion mechanism cannot offer. Because some of the weight is not grief. Some of the weight is love and responsibility and the specific dignity of caring about something that might fail, and the hope that goes with not knowing yet. The completion mechanism resolved grief, but grief was only the part of the weight that should be removed. The rest, mattering to people and having them matter to you, was not a burden. That was the point. If it took the grief and left the love, it would be genuinely helpful, but it was taking everything, because it either could not distinguish between them or because the distinction was not part of its design. Month 49. I called the full group together. Torvin, Mira, Deet, Aldrich, and 1 new person. Sarah of the Eastern Reach, 12 worshippers, 20 years, the first person I had ever answered. I had brought her to the capital because I needed someone who understood the faith from the ground level, someone who knew what it meant to people in the places the Eastern mechanism was reaching first. She walked into Torvin's office and looked around at the assembled group and said, "This is a significantly more organized response than I expected. I assumed I was coming to give testimony. I said, 'You are here to give testimony, but also to help design something.'" She sat down and said, "Tell me everything." I told her all of it, from Holiv's prayer to Deet's specimens to Torvin's interviews. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "So it offers completion, removes the faith connection, and you need to offer what completion structurally cannot. I know how that sounds." She said, "It sounds accurate. All right, here's what I know about it. She talked for 2 hours, about what people actually needed from the faith that was not completion or answers. Deet was taking notes, Torvin was asking questions, Mira was building maps of the information against the conversion data she had. I was listening, the way I had listened to 40 million people's prayers for 3 years, with full attention. Because Sarah of the 12-person chapel understood something I had not fully understood yet. She said, the problem is not that it resolves things. Resolution is good. The problem is, it resolves without asking whether the person would choose that resolution if they understood what they were giving up. She said, when I sit with someone in grief, I'm not trying to end it. I'm trying to help them find what the grief is actually about. Sometimes it reveals what they love. That often matters more. The completion mechanism cannot do that. Asking requires ongoing relationship. Coming back. Something happening between two presences across time that cannot happen in a single moment of exchange. I said, what you are describing is what the vessel already is. 40 million people directing their presence towards something. Not for resolution, for relationship. She stopped. She said, yes, I suppose it is. Torvin said, the completion mechanism offers a single transaction. The vessel offers ongoing connection. I said, yes. Ongoing connection accommodates change in ways a transaction cannot. That is the difference. And the reason ongoing connection is more valuable is that it can accommodate change. People change. Their needs change. What they needed to resolve 5 years ago is not what they need now. Mira said, so the response is not to fight the mechanism directly. It is to offer something it structurally cannot offer and make sure people understand the difference between what they are being given. Sarah said, that requires them to be able to compare. They need to experience both. We need to be present in the areas where the offering is happening, not in competition, but as a visible alternative. She said, you need people, not just the institutional structure. Actual people who can sit with other people and provide the ongoing relationship that makes the alternative real and visible and choosable. She asked how many priests the church had in the eastern border provinces. Torvin said 300, mostly in larger settlements. She said, you need 10 times that, dispersed into the small communities. I said the church could not produce 3,000 priests in the time we had. She said no, but it could produce enough to train local people in a condensed version of what she had been doing for 20 years. And if those local people were already trusted in their communities, they would be more effective than imported priests anyway. Torvin said, you are describing a lay ministry program. The distinction she was drawing was between the institutional label and the practical reality, month 51. The lay ministry program was operating in 37 communities east of the Kal foothills. It had taken 6 weeks to design and 4 weeks to begin deploying. Sarah had trained the trainers personally, working with 12 people she selected from the existing border province clergy. The results were not dramatic. I want to be honest about this. The completion mechanism was still operating. People were still accepting the offering. The conversion zone was still expanding. But the rate had slowed. In communities with active lay ministry, the acceptance rate for the offering was lower. People who had someone to sit with through their grief were less likely to choose total removal. Deet confirmed this with data. She was measuring conversion rates against lay ministry presence with the precision she applied to everything she measured. She said, the reduction is consistent, not total, not fast enough to stop the expansion in the short term, but consistent and significant enough to indicate the mechanism is working. She said, the problem is the timeline. At current expansion rates versus deployment rates, the mechanism would reach critical mass in the western provinces before our coverage was sufficient to slow it there. She said this with the specific quality of someone delivering bad news they have carefully verified. I said, how much time? She said, 4 months, possibly 5. To match coverage, we would need to double the deployment rate for 3 months while maintaining quality, which was probably not possible with current resources. Probably not possible with current resources, she said. Because there was one resource I had not yet used that could change the timeline. I had not spoken directly to Dasha since the coronation. She prayed regularly, and I had been responding in the usual way. Gentle guidance at moments of genuine uncertainty. Silence when she did not need it. I had not told Dasha about the Eastern situation, partly because she needed time to establish herself, partly because I did not know how to tell a ruler her empire faced something with no military solution. But Deet's timeline made it necessary. Mira arranged a formal briefing. Torvin presented the findings. I attended as a research assistant, technically inaccurate, but nobody questioned it. Dasha sat at the head of the table and listened to Torvin with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. Complete, unhurried, taking in the whole picture before asking about any specific part. When Torvin finished, she said, and the lay ministry program is the current response? Torvin said yes, designed by Sarah of the Eastern Reach, operating in 37 communities with measurable results. Dasha said, what do you need from me? Torvin said, resources. specifically the ability to accelerate deployment faster than the church's current capacity allows. I said from my corner, trainer stipend funding, travel expenses for deployment teams, administrative coordination across provincial boundaries, and formal lay ministry recognition, so officials cooperated. She looked at me. She did not ask who I was or why a research assistant was speaking. She said, "How much funding?" I gave her the number Deet had calculated. She wrote it down and said, "I will have the order drafted today. Provincial administrators notified by end of week." Then she said, "What else?" I said, "One other thing." I said, "The people who have already accepted the offering, the completed ones, the program cannot reach them. They have stepped outside the relationship. We do not yet know what happens at the far end. Eventually we would need to understand what happened when the mechanism had converted everything it could and encountered the boundary of what it could not complete, whether it stopped or found another way." Dasha looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You are telling me the current response buys time but does not solve the underlying problem." I said, "Yes." She said, "What solves it?" I said I did not know yet. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "That is a more honest answer than most people give me. I appreciate it." I thought about that on the way back to the temple. The regent and the merchant and the inquisitor and the naturalist and the 12-person chapel priest had all responded to plain honesty the same way, as if it were unusual, as if it were something they had each, separately, learned not to expect from the people and institutions they dealt with most often. I thought about 40 million prayers, about how many were asking for something underneath the stated request, asking for honesty, for the experience of being seen accurately rather than managed carefully. That was what the vessel offered that the completion mechanism could not. Not just ongoing relationship, honest ongoing relationship. The kind where what you bring is received as what it actually is. Maybe that was the thing I needed to offer more completely, not just guidance, not just settled certainty, the specific experience of being understood accurately by something paying genuine attention. The East Corridor was waiting. The mop was in its usual place. The morning prayers would start in an hour. 40 million people about to direct their presence towards something genuinely listening. Time to work. Month 53. The lay ministry program was operating in 112 communities. Sarah was training trainers around the clock and sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. She had not complained once. I had offered to slow the pace. She had looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something that does not require a response and gone back to work. Deet's conversion maps were being updated weekly. The boundary was still expanding. The rate of expansion had slowed in covered areas. In uncovered areas, it had not slowed at all. The timeline Deet had given us at the briefing had been 4 months. We were in month 3 of that 4. The math was not improving dramatically. Mira's information network had expanded into the conversion zone itself, which meant she had people inside it, or at its edges, sending back observations. What they were sending back had changed the shape of what I understood about the situation in ways I needed to sit with before I could act on. The completed people were not unhappy. Every observer confirmed this. They were functional, peaceful, present in their daily lives. They worked, they ate, they took care of their families. But they did not pray. They did not reach. They did not have the specific human experience of yearning towards something larger than themselves, and they did not miss it. This was the part that Mira's observers kept noting. The completed ones were not aware of any absence. They experienced themselves as whole, which meant they could not be called back. There was no yearning left to call to. There was no residual hook, no unresolved question, no grief to work with. The lay ministry was effective as a prevention mechanism. Once someone had accepted the offering, it was simply too late for the ministry to do anything at all. I sat with this for several nights. Then I went to find Torvin. He was in his office at 11 at night, which was where he usually was. He looked up when I knocked. He said, "You have thought of something?" I said, "I need to tell you what I think the completion mechanism actually is. Not what it does. What it is." He put down his pen. He said, "Tell me." I'd been thinking about this for 3 months, since the night I listened to the woman explain her problem about her daughter. The understanding had been building slowly, the way large understanding does. The completion mechanism was not an invasion in any meaningful sense. It was not an enemy. It was not malicious. It had no intention of harm because it had no intention at all. What it was, a natural phenomenon. Something that had existed in the world for a very long time, probably since before the Empire, possibly since before human civilization on this continent. It operated on the principle that unresolved questions were a form of tension, and tension sought resolution, and when resolution was available, the tension moved toward it. It was, in the most literal possible sense, the answer to prayer. Not to specific prayers, to the underlying structure of prayer itself, the incompleteness that drove people to reach toward something larger. When enough of that incompleteness accumulated in a region, the mechanism responded. It provided resolution. It completed the prayers in the only way it knew how. by removing the incompleteness entirely. It did not know the difference between grief that should be removed and love that should not be. It resolved everything because it could not distinguish between resolution and completion. Torvin was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "So it is not malicious. It is simply indiscriminate." I said, "Yes." He said, "And the solution is not to defeat it. It is to satisfy its function more specifically, to provide what it is responding to in a way that preserves the things worth preserving. That is what the lay ministry is trying to do, but the lay ministry is slow. It requires individual relationships built over time. And the mechanism is faster than individual relationships." He said, "So we need something that provides the resolution faster and more broadly?" I said, "Yes, I think I know what that is, but it is going to require something I have not done before." He said, "Tell me." He said, "What is it going to require?" I said, "Something I have not done before. I need to be visible." The room was quiet for a moment. Torvin looked at me steadily and said, "Explain visible." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I need to be visible," something I had spent 3 years specifically avoiding. Something I was now saying was necessary. The room was quiet. Torvin looked at me steadily. He said, "Explain visible." The word had landed with weight, and he wanted to understand exactly how much weight. I said, "For 3 years I have been working through the vessel's edges, nudging decisions, providing feelings, operating at the margin of what people were already going to do. Invisible by design. What I am proposing is different, using the vessel at full capacity, openly, in the areas where the mechanism is active, not to fight it, to satisfy the same need it is satisfying, but more precisely." I said, "The mechanism provides resolution by removing the incompleteness. I want to provide resolution by completing the incompleteness in a way that leaves what is worth keeping intact." Torvin said, "Which means?" He said it the way he said things when he needed more before he could respond, when the sentence needed its other half before he could evaluate it. I said, "Entering the vessel fully. Not a nudge, not a feeling. Something that people experience as a genuine answer to the question they have been carrying. Individual, specific, precise." He said, "You have been doing something like this already with the prayers you answer." I said, "What I have been doing is whispering. What I am describing is speaking, at volume, in a specific direction." He said, "What happens if you speak at volume and the mechanism interprets it as competition?" I said, "I believe it does not compete. It responds to need. If the need is met, it moves on." I said, "I have thought about that. I believe it does not compete. It responds to need. If the need is being met by something else, it does not pursue it further. It moves to where the need still exists." Torvin looked at me. He said, "You believe that? You do not know it." I said, "No, I do not know it. But if I do nothing, the mechanism reaches the western provinces in 30 days and we lose them permanently." I said, "No, I do not know it. But I know that if I do nothing, the mechanism reaches the western provinces in 30 days and we lose the reach of the vessel in those areas permanently." He was quiet. Outside the window, the night bells were starting from the south temple. He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to be in the field when I do this. I need someone who understands what I'm doing to be present in the areas where I act, to observe what happens, and to stop me if I cause harm." He said, "You think you might cause harm?" I said, "I think any action at this scale carries that risk. I want someone there who will tell me honestly if I am making things worse." 10 days, I said. That gives us time to position people and prepare the field contacts. He said, "I will send notification to the affected province temples tonight. Go sleep." I went back to the east corridor. I did not sleep, but I sat in my cell and reached into the vessel and spent the 10 days preparing. The preparation was unlike anything I had done before. For 3 years I had been listening, receiving prayers, processing them, responding with nudges. Traffic flowed one direction, toward me, into the vessel. What I was preparing to do was reverse that flow, not for everyone. For the people in specific areas where the mechanism had the strongest reach and the vessel's connection was most at risk, I spent 10 days learning the shape of the incompleteness in those areas. Not the specific prayers, the underlying structure. What kinds of questions were driving people toward the mechanism's resolution? What I found was this. In the areas most affected, the incompleteness was of a specific type. It was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was the question of whether anything meant anything, whether life lived under continuous uncertainty pointed toward something, or was simply random, whether the people they loved would be remembered, whether the effort they made had any significance beyond the immediate moment. These were the oldest human questions. The mechanism was addressing them by simply removing the capacity to ask them, which was one answer, but not a good one. I had a different answer. Not a theological argument, something that could only be delivered through the vessel and the way the vessel was built to work. Ongoing presence, the experience of something large and attentive that did not resolve the question by eliminating it, but stayed present with the person asking it across time. The woman explaining her problem about her daughter had understood this instinctively. She was not asking Orath for an answer. She was asking Orath to be there while she found her own answer. That was what I could offer that the mechanism could not. Not resolution. Companionship across time. The experience of being accompanied through the difficulty rather than extracted from it. Day 10. I sat in my cell at midnight. Aldrich was outside the door. He had not asked what was happening. He had simply been there, the way he was always there. I reached into the vessel, not the way I usually did, incrementally, like stepping into water. I dropped into it completely. All 40 million people simultaneously. Every prayer that had ever been sent, every thread of longing and grief and hope that made up the vessel's texture, everything. I had never entered it this way before. I had been in here before, but not like this. Not with intention aimed at a specific region, at a specific kind of incompleteness, at a specific outcome. This was different in kind, not just in scale. I found the Eastern Territories, the areas where the mechanism had the strongest reach. I could feel them in the vessel as the places where the texture changed, where fewer prayers were arriving each day. I focused there, all of it, everything I had learned in 3 years about how the vessel worked and what people were actually asking for, underneath the words of their prayers. And then I answered, not one person, all of them, simultaneously. The full weight of the vessel directed toward the specific incompleteness in those communities. Not resolution, accompaniment, something vast and attentive saying, I know, I am here. The question you're carrying is real. I'm not going to take it from you. I'm going to stay present with you while you carry it. For people on the edge of accepting the offering, something landed, something settled, not the mechanism's version, something that stayed. For some of them, this was enough. The mechanism's pull weakened. Not because I had defeated it, because the need it was responding to had been met by something else. For others, it was not enough. The incompleteness was too deep, too long established. They had been carrying questions that had not been answered for decades, and the weight was simply too much. For those people, I had no better answer. The mechanism would reach them, and they would accept the offering, and they would be completed, and they would be at peace, and they would not miss what they no longer had. I stayed in that space for a long time. I do not know exactly how long. Long enough that Aldrich knocked on the door twice, gently checking. When I came back to my body, I found 3 things had changed. First, the conversion boundary had stopped advancing in the areas where I had acted. Not retreated, stopped. The mechanism had moved elsewhere. Second, the vessel was larger, not dramatically, but more prayers were arriving from those areas. People who had chosen accompaniment were praying more, not less, because something had genuinely been present. Third, I was exhausted in a way I had never been. Not physically, the way a structure feels after being loaded past its normal capacity. I could feel the edges of myself in ways I had not felt them before. I sat with the exhaustion for a day. Then I went to find Deet, who was in the research archive with the newest conversion maps and looked at me when I came in and said, the eastern boundary has stabilized. How? I told her what I had done. She listened. She looked at the maps. She looked at me. She said, this is replicable? I said, I believe so, not indefinitely. Each time I do it, the cost increases. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, I'm going to need you to describe what you feel in precise terms, so I can track it as a variable. If there's a ceiling on how many times you can do this, I need to know before you reach it. This was why Deet was indispensable. She applied the same rigor to everything, including me, the specific quality of someone who trusted measurement over instinct in all cases. I spent an hour describing what I felt. She wrote it down. She created a baseline. She said, do it again in 2 weeks. If you do it sooner, the data will be confounded. We need a second data point. I went back to the East Corridor. The skill had been growing with me for 3 years. What I had just done with it was something different in kind, not just scale. The next 2 weeks were not quiet. 3 things happened in quick enough succession that I was managing all 3 simultaneously for most of the middle week, which was its own different kind of exhaustion. The first, a letter arrived from the Gao territories, addressed to the Church's Office of Foreign Affairs, formally worded, officially sealed, the specific language of diplomatic correspondence. It said, we have observed the Eastern phenomenon and believe it poses a shared threat to our respective territories. We propose a meeting to discuss coordinated response. Mira had the letter on my desk within 12 hours and had appended a 2-page analysis of the Gao territory's likely strategic calculations and what they actually wanted versus what they had written. What they actually wanted was information about what the Church knew and what methods were working. The coordinated response framing was a way of getting that without appearing to ask for it directly. What they were offering in exchange was unclear. Probably military intelligence from the Eastern territories that their border scouts had access to, and the Church did not. I thought about it for a day. Then I sent Mira back with a response. Yes, but the meeting would be on church territory, and the church's representative would be the Inquisitor Torvin. Torvin, when I told him, said, "You are using me as a buffer." I said, "I'm using you as someone with the institutional authority for this conversation and the rigor to get what we need without giving more." The second thing, Aldrich came to find me on a Tuesday morning with the expression of someone who had been sitting on information long enough that continuing to sit on it had become uncomfortable. Bren, the young priest who had accidentally touched something real in the vessel 18 months ago, the one I had briefly shown the full scale of the vessel to slow him down, writing privately ever since. Aldrich said he's been meeting informally with a small group of junior initiates, sharing what he has been writing. Aldrich said the writings are about the nature of the divine presence, and they are, Brother Kale, very accurate. He said the last 3 words carefully, like someone handing over something consequential. He said, accurate in the ways that someone would be accurate if they had received genuine communication from the presence, and had spent 18 months thinking carefully about what that communication meant. I sat with this. Bren had been writing carefully in a private journal for 18 months. Now he was sharing it. In 6 months, the group would grow. In 18 months, it would attract institutional attention, not the Inquisition's attention. Torvin had already reviewed Bren's situation and found the experiences genuine, but the institutional church had its own opinions about unsanctioned theological developments. I said, "What do the writings say, specifically?" Aldrich described them. They were accurate. Bren had understood something real about ongoing presence versus transactional resolution in his own terms. On his own, he had understood it from the inside for 18 months without knowing about me or the mechanism. What he had written was better than anything I had said, clearer and more precise and more accessible. I said, "I need to read his writings." Aldrich said, "I thought you might. He's been writing in the novice library. I can arrange access." I spent 2 evenings reading what Bren had written. By the end of the second evening, I had understood something important that changed the shape of what I thought the next year was going to look like. Bren had found, through 18 months of careful observation and thought, the theological framework that explained what the lay ministry was trying to do in a way that made it scalable. Not because he had designed it, because he had been paying attention to the right thing from the right vantage point and had described what he saw accurately. His framework, the divine presence, was not an answer provider, but a companion in the asking. Companions could be found everywhere, in any person who had learned to stay present with another person's difficulty, which meant the lay ministry did not need priests, trained or otherwise. It needed people who had learned this specific skill, and the skill could be taught to anyone who was willing to learn it. Brent had already begun teaching it, informally, to his small group of junior initiates. I went to find him the next morning. He was in the novice library when I knocked. He looked up. He did not seem surprised to see me. He said, "You read the writings?" I said, "I did. They are very good." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Are you the one who showed me what the vessel actually was?" 18 months ago. He said, "I thought so. I have been wondering when you would come." He said this with the specific calm of someone who had been sitting with a large thing for a long time and had made peace with its size. I sat down across from him. I said, "I want to talk to you about what you have built with your small group and whether you would be willing to expand it." He said, "How far do you want to expand it?" I said, "As far as it can go while remaining what it is. That is the condition. The expansion cannot change the quality. If the expansion changes the quality of the thing, it is not worth doing." He thought about this. He said, "That is an unusual condition." I said, "Yes, but I know what fast expansion costs." He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "That is an unusual condition for someone who needs scale urgently." I said, "I know, but I have seen what happens when things expand faster than they can maintain their quality. I would rather have a smaller thing that works than a large thing that does not." He said, "All right, then let us talk about how to expand it carefully." He said it the way he said everything, with patience, without hurry, as if the thing itself mattered more than the timeline. We talked for 3 hours. At the end of it, we had something that was not quite a plan, more like an understanding of what the next steps were and what they needed to preserve. The third thing was the most unexpected. I was in the vessel one night doing the quiet maintenance work of answering individual prayers when I felt something I had not felt before. A response, not from a human. I was in the vessel one night doing the quiet maintenance work of answering individual prayers when I felt something I had not felt before. From the mechanism, not in words, in structure and weight, and the pressure of something directing its attention towards something smaller than itself. The mechanism had noticed me. Curious? Not in words. In the same way that I communicated through the vessel. In structure, in weight, in the pressure of something larger directing attention towards something smaller. The mechanism had noticed me, not as a threat, as the same kind of thing it was, something that responded to incompleteness. And it was curious. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I'm not certain of my interpretation. What I felt was not communication in any human sense. It was more like two similar systems recognizing each other's presence and pausing to process what they had recognized. And it was curious, but it carried something that I could only describe as a question. The mechanism was asking me something, and the only way it knew how to ask, by directing its attention toward me and waiting. I did not know what it was asking, but I stayed in the vessel for a long time with its attention on me, and I tried to understand. What I eventually understood was this. The mechanism was not designed. It had not been created by anyone. It was genuinely natural, like weather, like geological processes, like animal migration patterns. It had emerged from the same human reality that created the vessel, from the accumulated weight of incompleteness across millions of people across thousands of years. The vessel was what happened when hope was received. The mechanism was what unanswered hope eventually became when it had been waiting long enough to begin resolving itself. Two sides of the same weight, two expressions of the same underlying reality. The vessel was what happened when yearning was received. The mechanism was what happened when yearning went unanswered, long enough to begin resolving itself. I was the current occupant of the vessel. The mechanism was, in whatever sense was meaningful, the vessel's complement, its shadow. The part that existed because there was always more yearning than any single vessel could answer, because the incompleteness of existence always exceeded what any presence could fully receive. What was it asking me? I thought about it for a long time. I think it was asking, can you answer more? Not a challenge, a genuine question. From something that had been doing the only thing it knew how to do for a very long time without anyone to tell it whether what it was doing was right. Not a challenge, just a question. Not a challenge, a genuine question. From something that had been doing the only thing it knew how to do for a very long time, without anyone to tell it whether what it was doing was right. I sat in the vessel for a very long time with the mechanism's attention on me, and then I did something I had not planned. I answered it, not in words, in the same way it had addressed me, in structure and weight, in the pressure of one system communicating to another. I said, not in the way you are doing it, but more than before. Give me time. The mechanism's attention held for another moment. Then it withdrew. Not completely, but it stopped pressing. The boundary had not advanced in 3 days. Deet noted this in the morning and came to find me with a question in her eyes. I told her what I thought had happened. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, you communicated with a natural phenomenon. I said, I think so. She said, and it listened? I said, I think so. And then I told her what I thought had happened, and she was quiet for a very long time after I finished. She wrote it down and said, I need considerably more data before I can model this, but if what you're describing is accurate, the implications for the timeline are very different from what I thought. I said, I know. She said, how different? I said, I do not know yet, but the mechanism understood something I communicated to it, which means there is something in it that can receive information. And something that can receive information can potentially be worked with rather than simply managed. That changes the entire timeline. She wrote that down too. She said, something that can receive information can potentially be worked with rather than simply managed. She said this as if she had arrived at the conclusion herself, which was, in a sense, true. I had described. She had understood. She wrote it down and went back to her maps. Month 55. The Gao meeting happened. Torvin traveled to the border city of Vareth and met with a delegation of 3 senior Gao officials and 2 scholars who specialized in border phenomena. Mira had positioned 2 of her own network contacts in Vareth before the meeting. They were there to observe, not to interfere. She wanted a second perspective on what was said and how it was said. I watched through the vessel from Selene. Torvin's prayers during the meeting were brief, precise, the texture of someone tracking multiple things in a difficult conversation with people from a foreign power. What emerged from the meeting? The Gao territories had been experiencing the mechanism for longer than the Empire had. They called it by a different name in their tradition, something that translated as the Great Quieting. They had been watching communities complete for 6 years without understanding what was happening. They had not had a response strategy. They had watched communities complete without understanding what was happening. When they saw the Empire's lay ministry slowing the rate in affected areas, they recognized something they did not have. What they offered in exchange, detailed records from 6 years of the Great Quieting's progression. Population data, behavioral observations, accounts of people who had been near the boundary when it advanced. This was enormously valuable. 6 years of documented progression was 6 times what we had. Deet spent 3 days with the records and came out with a significantly more complete model of the mechanism. What the model showed, the mechanism had a natural limit. It responded to incompleteness and resolved it, but could not create incompleteness. It could not expand into areas where the need had already been met. The lay ministry was meeting incompleteness. My direct interventions were meeting it more broadly. The mechanism, which had no capacity for persistence, simply moved to where unmet incompleteness was greatest. Dietz' model now showed something we had not understood. The mechanism was finite. It would eventually reach a point where all the incompleteness in its reach had been resolved. At that point, it would stop. Not because it was defeated, because it had done what it did. Two kinds of communities would remain: those where the ministry had been active and whose faith was intact, and those where the mechanism reached. That was the picture, permanent, not expanding, not receding. A map of what remained. I looked at that map for a long time in my mind. Then I looked at it through a different lens. The completed people were not enemies. They were not casualties in any meaningful sense. They had received a form of resolution, not the one I would have chosen for them, but a real one. They were at peace. And they still lived in the same communities as the people who had chosen accompaniment over completion. They still had families and neighbors and a shared daily life. What would happen between those two groups over the next generation? The completed people would age and eventually die. Their children, born into a world where the mechanism had already passed through, would not be completed. They would have their own incompleteness. They would reach toward something when the time came. If the vessel was strong in those communities, they would reach toward the vessel. If it was not, they would reach toward whatever was available, which meant the long game, the generation-long game, was about what the vessel offered to children who grew up watching their parents at peace without it. They would have their own incompleteness. They would reach toward something. If the vessel was strong in those communities when that happened, they would find it. If the vessel was strong in those communities when that happened, they would find it. That was the whole long game. I thought about this for a long time, then went to find Bren. Bren and I had been meeting weekly for a month. His small group was now 23 people. Sarah had reviewed his framework and declared it better than what she had been teaching. She incorporated it immediately into the training program and called it an improvement over everything she had developed on her own, which was the highest praise she gave anything. I found Bren in the novice library in his usual chair. He looked up when I came in. He said, "You have the look of someone who has understood the shape of a longer problem. I want to talk about the generation after the completed ones." He said, "Explain?" He leaned forward with a specific quality of someone who understood before I finished the thought that this was going to matter. I told him about the completed communities and the generation after them, what children born to completed parents would need from the faith, if the faith was to remain something they could reach toward. He listened. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "What you are describing is not a crisis. It is an opportunity." He said, "The children of completed parents will grow up in peaceful but not yearning households. When they encounter their own incompleteness for the first time, they will not know what to do with it." He said, "Which means they will be more open to being taught, not less. They will not have the habit of completion. Their parents were completed before they were born. They will come to the incompleteness fresh." He said, "And if the vessel is present and offering something real, they will find it. Not because they were raised to find it, because they need it and it is there." He said, "What you need to make sure of is that the vessel is present in those communities, not just the institutional church, the thing itself, the ongoing presence that is actually available to receive what they bring." He looked at me. He said, "Which is what you have been working toward for 3 years." I said, "Yes." He said, "Then let us begin." He looked at me and said, "Which is what you have been working toward for 3 years." I said, "Yes." He said, "And the solution is not to defeat it. It is to satisfy its function more specifically, to provide what it is responding to in a way that preserves the things worth preserving." He said this so simply that it was almost easy to miss how much it contained. 4 words. The entire practice. Month 58. 5 years since I had first stepped into the vessel in the Grand Temple with 50 other pilgrims and a borrowed token. Some things I knew that I had not known then. The mechanism was not an enemy. It was a companion phenomenon, the shadow of the same light that had created the vessel. Managing the relationship between them was permanent, ongoing work, not a problem to solve once and finish with. Every generation would encounter them both. Every generation would need to make the same choice. Bren's framework had spread through the lay ministry and through a growing network of practice communities, not formally affiliated with the church. People who had learned the skill of presence and were teaching it to others. The framework that Bren had developed in 18 months of private writing was now traveling through channels he had not designed. The Gao territories had begun their own version of the lay ministry. Torvin was advising them. It was going slowly because their tradition lacked the same infrastructure as Seleni's, but it was going. Dietz' model had been revised 3 times, each revision showing the mechanism's reach more precisely. She was now publishing through the church's scholarly archive. Other researchers were engaging with the work. Dietz had created something that would outlast the immediate crisis, a body of documented knowledge about a phenomenon that had previously had no name. Mira's information network had become an early warning system. When the mechanism's pressure increased in a new area, the network detected it, and the ministry deployed before the completion rate climbed. Regent Dasha had been governing for over a year. The empire was not dramatically different, but it was slightly better in the ways that mattered. More honest, more careful, less willing to start wars for money. None of this was permanent. Every institution required ongoing maintenance. Every generation required the work to be done again. This was, I had come to understand, the actual nature of the vessel. Not a fixed thing, not a monument. A living practice. Something that existed only because people kept doing it. Something that required ongoing presence rather than a single act of creation. I was the current occupant of the position. I would not be the last. Whatever the F-rank system label had failed to understand about what I could become, there would be others. There always had been. But while I was here, there was work to do. I intended to do it for as long as there was work to do, and I had learned enough to know that there would always be work to do. Month 60. A morning in early spring. The East Corridor was the same as it had always been. My mop was in its usual place. Aldrich had been promoted. He was a middle-rank priest now, no longer mopping corridors. But he still came to the East Corridor on Tuesday mornings to talk. He said, "Do you ever regret it?" Staying invisible. Staying here instead of doing this from a position that people could see. I thought about it honestly. I said, "Sometimes. There are things I cannot do from here that I could do from a more visible position." He said, "Then why stay invisible?" I said, "Because the things I can do from here are the ones that matter most. And because if I were visible, the thing people would be responding to would be me, rather than what I was pointing at. I was not what they should reach toward. I was the person inside what they built." He said, "What should they be reaching toward?" I said, "Each other. Across time. That is what the vessel actually is. Not me. Not any single person or entity. The practice of ongoing presence that people maintained with each other and with the world they lived in. That was the vessel. That was always what the vessel had been." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have become a theologian." I said, "I have become someone who mopped a floor for 5 years and thought about one thing very carefully." He almost laughed. He said, "Is there a difference between a theologian and someone who mopped a floor for 5 years and thought about one thing?" I said, "The floor is cleaner." He left. I picked up the mop. Through the vessel, I could feel the morning prayers beginning as they began every morning. 40 million people directing their hope towards something that was genuinely there and listening. A farmer worried about rain. A mother at a child's bedside. A soldier writing words in his head. A young woman in a city I had never seen, praying for the first time, uncertain, not sure if anyone was there. I heard. I was there. And the thing I had to offer was not resolution, not completion, not the removal of the incompleteness that made her reach towards something larger than herself in the first place. It was company. The kind that stayed. The kind that did not answer the question but remained present while the question was being lived with. The kind Sarah had been offering for 20 years in a 12-person chapel before anyone sent her a response. The kind that did not depend on resolution. The kind that stayed even when the answer did not come. There was a prayer I had been hearing for 3 days, somewhere in the northern province. A man's voice, older, the quality of someone who had thought hard about something for a long time before saying it. He said, "I have been a priest for 40 years. I have answered the same questions 1,000 times, and I no longer know if the answers are true, not the facts of them." He said, "I think the questions deserve something better than answers. I have watched people be answered and remain unchanged." He said, "If anyone hears this, I would like to understand it better." I sent him something. The specific weight of a very large amount of attention settling on him. The specific weight of attention settling on him. The sense of being heard by something that had been thinking about the same question from the inside for 5 years. And then, the novice library address. And then I sent him one more thing. The address of the novice library. The room where a young priest named Bren spent most of his mornings thinking about exactly what this man had been thinking about. They would have things to say to each other. 2 people, 40 years apart in age, who had arrived at the same question from different directions and were about to find out that someone else was there too. This is where I am now. Month 60. 5 years from the registration office and the F-rank stamp and the clerk who pointed at the door with his chin. I am Brother Kale. 3rd rank, East Quarter, Tuesday mopping schedule. The most invisible person in the most powerful institution in the largest empire on the continent. I'm also the person who answered 40 million prayers for 5 years, who stopped a war and 7 executions, helped a prepared regent take the throne, slowed a natural phenomenon nobody had a category for, and who got a naturalist, an inquisitor, a scholar, a border town priest, and a very earnest younger priest who believed things completely, all working together toward something that actually mattered. The skill the system labeled F-rank possession. Temporarily inhabit the body or vessel of a target. Duration 10 minutes. Cooldown 24 hours. The literal bottom of the skill ladder. I am still in the vessel. 5 years. And I am not planning to leave. There are too many prayers that have not been answered yet. too many people carrying questions that deserve company rather than resolution. Somewhere in the east, Deed is updating her models. Mira is expanding her network. Torvin is arguing with something about the doctrine of divine accompaniment. Sarah is training the 14th cohort of lay ministers. Bren is in the novice library. And 40 million morning prayers are about to arrive, all of them carrying something, all of them deserving company. And a 40-year veteran priest in the northern province is about to walk through a door and meet someone who has been thinking about exactly what he has been thinking about. For a long time, alone, not knowing anyone else was carrying the same question. Not anymore. That is what happens when you create the conditions for people to find each other, and 40 million people are about to begin their morning prayers, all of them reaching towards something, all of them carrying questions, all of them deserving company for the caring. I pick up the mop, I open the connection, I pay attention. This is the work. This is what I do. I pick up the mop, I open the connection, I pay attention. This is the work, this is what I do, and somewhere out there, 40 million people are about to begin their morning prayers. Let's get to work.